Well, thank you very much. I'll grab the remote here. Step back in camera. Hi, guys. So don't let the monkey suit fool you. I am, first and foremost, a bartender. I'm just a guy who likes to make a really good drink, and I've been very fortunate to have a very remarkable career, because 20 years ago, this job didn't really exist. So who am I? My name is Brian Van Flandern. I am formerly the #2 ranked mixologist in the world. I opened up a restaurant in 2004 called Per Se for Chef Thomas Keller. It was opened up to Michelin 3 stars, Mobile 5 stars, New York 4 stars. I was the #1 new restaurant in the world that year. And honestly, I'll be honest with you, I BS'd my way into the job. I knew a little bit about wine, and I had a buddy who was a notorious consumer of alcohol. He knew I made good cocktails, and he was with Maitre D', so I had to go through 7 interviews to get this job, 7 interviews to get a bartending job. Then we did 6 weeks of training, and then we opened up for 5 days, and there was a little fire in the kitchen. We shut down for another 6 weeks. Training wages, oh man, it was crazy, but it just opened my eyes. And since then, I've gone on to, as I say, I was competing internationally. I was ranked #2 in the world, and I do stuff on the Food Network with Ina Garten and with on the Barefoot Contessa, Bar Rescue. I'm not proud of Bar Rescue. I mean, you guys probably all know it, but it's not. I mean, that's kind of the low end of the industry. I'm more at the high end of the industry. But John's a really nice guy. I'm going to say this right now, because this happened to me about a month ago. I was at another client, and I got in there, and the bartending staff was like this, and they were all arms crossed, and they were like, and I started doing my thing, and by the end of the day, people started smiling, relaxing. Everyone's going. They said, "We thought you were going to come in here and yell at us." Like, John, I'm not a yeller. I'm an educator. I'm a nice guy, so I hear what you teach. So today, over the next 5 days, we're going to talk about spirits education. We're going to talk about how the spirits behind your bar are made and the stories behind them. Not only what's the difference between vodka, gin, and tequila and rum, what's the difference between Tanqueray and Tanqueray 10? What's the difference between Bombay and Bombay Sapphire? What's the difference between, how is the different styles of tequila or bourbon? You know, we're in whiskey country. We definitely want to know what's the difference between bourbon, straight bourbon, single barrel bourbon, small batch bourbon, bottled and bond bourbon, and how is that different from Tennessee whiskey? Because it is a difference. And then how is Tennessee whiskey different from rye? And how is that different from malted barley, which is a American style of whiskey? And then we also have Canadian whiskey. How's that different? And then we have Irish whiskey and single malt scotches and Scotch blends and blended scotches, which is something different. And then Japanese whiskeys. And oh my gosh, it gets. So here's the deal. By the end of the day, you guys are going to know more than 99.9% of all bartenders in the world about the spirits behind your bar, how they're made, and what makes a good quality spirit versus a well-marketed spirit. And it's because there's plenty of really fancy bottles and really, high-priced stuff out there. It's not particularly good necessarily. And on the other hand, there's some really reasonably priced, inexpensive stuff which is really well made and has got a lot of flavor, and that's what we want, is flavor. Today is going to be really interesting information, so I suggest you take notes if you can, and I love questions, so don't be shy, ask questions. But the rest of the week is much more interactive and much more tasty and fun. So we're going to have a lot of fun this week, and so let's get into it. So first and foremost, alcohol has been around for quite a long time. Initially, it was naturally fermented beverages. Naturally fermented beverages like wine, beer, mead, sake, even ciders. These are naturally fermented, and the first one we think was probably mead, and it was probably an accident. Because back in the day, drinking water was always a dicey proposition, because depending on where the water came from, it could have all kinds of bacteria and all kinds of stuff in it. I mean, they didn't have sewers back then, so you never knew if you're drinking the local well water whether there was, all nasty germs and all kinds of stuff. So they usually put in something like honey, and honey actually has natural enzymes which will kill off most bacteria. And so they put in honey in the water, also made it sweet, but it would kill it off. And what happened is when it sat for a long time, the honey would actually ferment and it would become alcoholic. People say, hey, not only does this taste good, but I'm feeling really good too. So naturally fermented beverages, and we're going to call, for today's purposes, we're going to call that a beer. Now, there are actually very strict rules of beer in Bavaria, it has to have hops and all this nonsense. But today, I'm just going to refer to any naturally fermented beverage, wine, beer, sake, cider. We're going to call it a beer. So the question for you guys is, what 3 things do I need in order to make a naturally fermented beverage? Sugar, yes, you have to have some source of sugar. And it could be sugar, but what other kinds of sugars are there? Honey, what's that? Starch. It could be something that's starchy. And anything that's starchy, like grains or potatoes, those actually have these starch molecules. And when we unravel those starch molecules, they become glucose or simple sugars. And so this is not a chemistry class, I promise you. And judging by who I thought was a marine biologist or whatever, it sounds like you guys probably know a lot more about chemistry than I do. So I'm not going to get into all of that, but I'm going to say this. The sugar molecule is made up of hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. And when it comes into contact, so okay, we'll get to that in a second. So we have sugar. Yes. What else? Yeast. And what is yeast? Yeast is a living thing. It's a microorganism, and it feeds on sugar. That's the primary source of food for yeast, to not only reproduce but also to live, to survive. So, and what's the third ingredient? Water. Of course, water is the most important ingredient because you got to have that. So it's kind of like the medium in which the yeast survives, and it gobbles up the sugar. And when the yeast eats the sugar molecule, a chemical transformation takes place, and it splits off into 2 separate molecules. One is carbon dioxide, or CO2, and the other is either the ethanol or the methanol alcohol molecule. And don't worry, again, it's not a chemistry class, but I just want to let you know that through natural fermentation, we had water and honey, or grape juice, and which has lots of sugars in it. The natural yeast, or we add yeast, gobbles up the sugar and converts it into alcohol. And now we have a naturally fermented beverage. So what percentage of alcohol is a typical beer? 4.5%, 5%. How high can a beer get? What's the highest percentage of alcohol a beer can get naturally? Any idea? 8? Well, I have seen some that are 8, 8.5, 9, but it can get even higher technically. Sure. Well, think about wine. What's the highest percentage of alcohol that a wine can get up to? About 15, that's right. So here's the deal. Naturally fermented beverages can get up to about 15.5, almost 16% alcohol by volume, but they can't go higher than that. And why is that? Because we're going to talk about distilled spirits. All of these spirits behind here are 40%, 50%, 60% alcohol by volume. We're going to talk about that in a second. But through natural fermentation, how come you can only get up to 16% alcohol? Anybody know?
Because it runs out of ingredients to make alcohol.
You can say it's the sugar, the yeast gobbles up the sugar, and eventually all the sugar runs out. So the food runs out. But we can always add more sugar. But does the alcohol continue to rise? The answer is no, and here's why. Imagine I'm standing inside of a 1 by 1 foot glass box, okay? It goes from here to the ceiling, 1 by 1 foot. And from above, we can lower down some tubes. I get as much oxygen as I need. I'm feeding in oxygen. I have a little hamster tube so I can drink as much water, drink as much water as I want. A little feeding tube so I can eat as much food as I want. I got food, I got water, I got oxygen, I got everything I need. I can even lie back, sleep if I need to, but I'm in a 1 by 1 foot square box going all the way to the ceiling. How long could I survive in that box? More importantly, what's eventually going to kill me? The box? Poop. Yes. Waste. My own waste is going to kill me. That's exactly right. Eventually, my number one and number two, my poop, is going to rise all the way up here. Gets up to here, I'm going to die. In fact, I'll probably die long before that, but that's not the point. The point is, eventually I'm going to die in my own waste. Sounds pretty disgusting, that's true. But what we need to think about is, when you think about yeast eating sugar, sugar is yeast food, and ethanol alcohol, or ethanol molecules, are yeast waste. And when the yeast waste gets up to about 15.5 to 16% alcohol by volume, the alcohol becomes toxic to the yeast and the yeast dies. So it can never exceed 15 to 16% through natural fermentation, because the yeast will eventually die in its own waste. Make sense? All right. I mention that because all of these spirits, there are distilled spirits, are much higher in alcohol. So how do we get spirits, how do we achieve spirits way above 15 or 16% alcohol by volume? Through a process called distillation. And I'm sure that's pretty rudimentary. Y'all all like, yeah, we know that. But distillation is a very specific process. Let's talk about that. So what we do is we use it through a still. And the way the still works is, we have a big pot or a column, and we add a bunch of water to it. And inside that water, we add some source of sugar. And that sugar could be cane sugar, it could be honey, it could be fruits, it could be grains that are starchy. And we can add amylases or another enzyme to break down those starches so they convert into glucose. Either way, we have sugar. And then we have to add some sort of yeast. It could be natural. There's yeast is everywhere. There's yeast on our bodies right now. There's yeast floating around the trees outside. There's naturally occurring yeast is everywhere. And we can use naturally occurring yeast, or we can grow yeast in a controlled environment and then buy it like brewer's yeast or whatever and add it on deliberately. Either way, we take our pot with water, we add some source of sugar, we add our yeast, it gobbles it up, and now we have a beer, about 4 to 5% alcohol by volume. And then we add heat. So, what happens when I take a bottle of vodka and I put it in the freezer? I know college kids know this stuff.
It gets cold, it doesn't freeze.
It gets cold, but it doesn't freeze. It gets nice and thick, and it gets kind of viscous, right? Kind of oily, but it doesn't freeze. Why doesn't it freeze? Why?
Because it can't create crystals, like the components can't create ice.
What's that?
It can't create crystals, it doesn't create ice.
Yeah, well, you can freeze it. You can get crystals out of it, but you just have to get really, really cold. You can use something like liquid nitrogen, and you can convert ethanol into, you can freeze it, but in the freezer, it's just not cold enough. In other words, ethanol has a much lower freezing point than water does. Simple as that. In the same way that ethanol has a much lower freezing point to go from a liquid to a solid state, it has a much lower evaporation point to go from a solid state to a gaseous state. So when we add heat to our beer at much lower temperature than water, it converts into ethanol vapors. And so those ethanol vapors rise up off the top of our still. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, you've got this big pot, and ignore that unit in the middle there. That's kind of, it's called a thumper. It kind of feeds in the next batch. So just to pretend that unit in the middle doesn't exist. So you have the big pot, you've got water, you've got sugar. We let it ferment. The process of yeast eating sugar is called fermentation. That's what fermenting is. So now the yeast eats the sugar and turns it into ethanol alcohol. I've got a beer. I add heat, and the vapors rise up off the top, and they come all the way across to that unit on the right. And it's kind of like in that upper right-hand corner. It's just a big copper or big container filled with ice-cold water. And inside that zigzag thing there is a hollow copper coil. And it coils around the inside of that. And so those heated alcohol vapors now go into that with a cool outside because of the cooled water, and they condense and cool down, and they go back from a gaseous state to a liquid state, and out comes alcohol. only it comes out at a much higher percentage than it would in a beer. So there's two types of stills here. We have the copper pot or alembic still. And I know this might sound a little bit dry, guys, but when we start talking about all of these different whiskeys and gins and what makes them different from each other, I'm just giving you a vernacular and you can make it sense. This is the driest part of the whole lecture, I promise. But we're trying to let you guys know that there's different types of stills, and we're talking about the quality of these spirits. You're going to see that that knowing the type of still makes a huge difference. So there's the copper pot or alembic still. Those terms are interchangeable, copper pot or alembic, which looks like that one in the lower left. And then the middle there in the upper ones is called the column or continuous still, which is much more modern. The copper pot still goes back at least a couple thousand years. We know the Egyptians used to distill from copper pots in order to make perfumes. But in the 1850s, the guy named Aeneas Coffey created the column or continuous still, and during the Industrial Revolution, bottom line is you filled it with water, you added some sorts of sugar, flood it ferment, added heat, and as the ethanol vapors rose, different ethanols have different alcohols have different densities. There's ethanol and methanol, and depending on the density, it would stick to different plates and slide off, and they'd either recirculate it in the wash or they'd collect it and then redistill it again. Ethanol is good. Methanol is bad. If somebody ever gives you some local hooch they brewed up in their college dorm, they say, dude, you got to try this. Say, okay, pull out your lighter and just light it on fire. If it burns blue, sit there and say, all right, man, and party, have a great time. Drink responsibly. If it burns green, you sit there and say, you know what, dude, you go ahead, you can have that, and I'll stick with my stuff, because methanol is a poison. They're both poisons, only ethanol kills you much slower and it's much more fun, right? Methanol will kill you quick. And that's what we find in antifreeze. It's what you find in commercial grade perfumes. It's what you find in isopropyl medical alcohol. That's why you don't drink NyQuil. Well, NyQuil you can drink. That's why you don't drink isopropyl medical alcohol. So, methanol bad, ethanol good. And so the copper pot still was the old school way. And when we distill in a copper pot still, it comes off of the still at about 85% pure alcohol. So our beer that was 4.5% alcohol has now gone to 85% pure alcohol. That still means it's 15% other stuff, mostly water and impurities of distillation, but we can taste the raw material. The column or continuous still, which is probably the most commonly used still in production today, and 99% of everything consumed by most consumers is done in a column or continuous still. That's so efficient and so industrial that it strips away all of the impurities, and it does it to about 96% pure alcohol. So the column or continuous distills to 96% and the copper pot to about 85%. And that's important because it makes it sound like, well, the column is much superior, it's a better thing, right? The problem with it is it's so efficient at stripping out the bad stuff, it also strips out all the flavor and we can't taste the raw materials. That's why most vodkas are done in a column or continuous still, because it takes out all the flavor and it just naturally, it's neutral. But the best spirits in the world, the best whiskeys, the best cognacs, the best gins, even the best vodkas, in my opinion, are done in a copper pot alembic still, because in the hands of a master distiller, they remove all the impurities, but we can taste the raw material. So if I'm making a corn whiskey, I can taste that corn. If I'm making it with rye, I can taste the rye. So the best are done in a copper pot still. Okay, enough of the boring stuff. Just remember, copper pot alembic still to 85% alcohol, and a column or continuous still at about 96% pure ethanol. Okay, now, let's talk about Prohibition. You guys, who here has ever seen Boardwalk Empire on HBO? All right, nobody. Okay, that's fine, that's cool. No homework assignments, that's fine. But I will say this, it's all about Prohibition. So in 1920, the United States entered into a great experiment, and they made it illegal to manufacture and distribute and consume ethanol alcohol. in beer and wine and distilled spirits. What happened was, in 1920, women in this country earned the right to vote. Yay, great job, ladies. They took the right to vote because they should have had it all along. And all of a sudden, the voting bloc doubled. And all the politicians are like, okay, ladies, what do you want? Well, this is during the Victorian era, 1920s, and the vast majority of the voting women were white Anglo-Saxon or Christian women. In fact, the Women's Christian Temperance Society, they're the ones who advocated and lobbied for and said, we want to make it illegal to make and distribute and consume alcohol in the United States of America. And all the politicians were like, is there something else you want? They said, no, because our men are dying from consumption. They're drinking all this alcohol in these saloons and in these hotels, and they're getting drunk and they're coming home, and sometimes they're abusive and sometimes they're just drunk and they're dying, and we want to make alcohol illegal. And so the politicians wanted their vote, and so they passed the Volstead Act. A guy in Chicago named Volstead went to Congress on behalf of the Women's Christian Temperance Society, because there were no women in Congress back then, and he lobbied and made it illegal. They passed the law and said it's illegal to drink alcohol. Well, this had a profound influence on the alcohols that we drink today. Had a profound influence on tequila, had a profound influence on Canadian whiskey, profound influence on rum, and even Irish whiskey. All of those changed, and certainly American whiskey, bourbon and the like. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, but it's fascinating. During Prohibition, it was a failed experiment, gave rise to organized crime. You've heard of Al Capone and Nucky Thompson, St. Valentine's Day Massacre. You know, all of that came out of Prohibition when suddenly America went dry and people said, hey man, there's a great opportunity to make some money. It's very similar to the drug trade today with cocaine or crystal meth or any other drug. They made it illegal, and then some people took advantage. When we think about who took advantage, when you think of American aristocracy, that is the most elite names in American history for finances and rich, being financially rich. What names do you think of? The Vanderbilts, absolutely. How about the Rockefellers? How about the Kennedys? That's American aristocracy. Joe Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father, amassed the family fortune bootlegging illegal whiskey during Prohibition. Same with the Rockefellers, same with the Vanderbilts. They all made money. Chase Morgan, Chase made a lot of money bootlegging illegal whiskey during Prohibition. So it also, all the best American bartenders were in these great hotels like the Plaza Hotel in New York, or the, the St. Regis. These are famous hotels. Well, these guys are suddenly out of work. It's like being an auto mechanic and suddenly your country says, okay, we're going to make it illegal to manufacture, drive cars in this country. Well, what am I supposed to do for a living? I'm an auto mechanic, and there's no cars, and they're not building them, they're not selling them. What am I supposed to do? They all fled to Europe, and they started applying the trade in London and England and throughout France and other parts of the world as well. But the best ones fled. The ones who weren't so good, the guys just pulling beers and making some cocktails or whatever, those guys stuck around, and they were driven underground into these hidden bars called speakeasies. And I know you guys have heard of those because they're back in vogue. Speakeasies are the hot, cool thing now. In New York, there's some great place I call PDT. If you've never been, go there. PDT is, you walk in and it's a restaurant. It says Criff Dogs, and there's a big hot dog sign, a big giant hot dog, and on mustard on the hot dog it says "Eat Me." And you go inside and you go down into the place, and there's a bored clerk sitting there pouring beers and selling deep fried hot dogs and a bunch of video games, Pac-Man, Defender, the old school video games. And you're like going, dude, am I in the right place? And then off to the left you see this phone booth. By the way, when's the last time you ever saw a phone booth? You guys probably didn't ever seen the phone booth. And there's an old school phone booth. You go, what's that all about? And you open up the phone booth and you step inside, you pick up the phone, and you dial, it says dial 0. So you dial 0, somebody picks up the phone and goes, good evening, can I help you? And I said, yeah, I'm looking at this place, PDT. What's your name? Brian Van Flandern, party of four? Yeah. Are you all here? Yeah, we're all here. Welcome to PDT. And the back of the phone booth opens up, and now you go into this hidden railroad apartment, and there's a bar set up, and there's a jackalope on the wall, and they're making really killer cocktails. You know, in Vegas, which is where I live now, you go to the Cosmopolitan Casino and you go to the barber shop, and it's a real barber shop. They give you clean shave and everything you want, and you go over to the janitor's closet. You open up the janitor's closet, there's the mop, there's everything you expect in a janitor's closet. In the back, there's another door with a little slot. You knock, password, and you sit there and say, you know, giggle water, and the door opens up and you go in, there's a stage, there's a live band rocking out in this long wooden bar, and they're making killer cocktails. Well, the same was going on back then. The 21 Club in New York was famous for making cocktails. And the thing was, there was tons of whiskey flowing, tons of liquor flowing throughout Prohibition. Everybody knew where the liquor was coming from. The cops knew, but the cops would constantly go in there and try to raid it. The 21 Club was famous in Midtown Manhattan because everybody would go there to get soused. But while you sat down, you sit there and order your whiskey, they'd give you a teacup and saucer. And they just pour the whiskey in there, and you can sit there and drink your saucer. And then if the cop said, this is a raid, you just set it down on the bar, and the bar was like, 20 feet long. You had to have a couple people. Every 5 feet, there was a little wooden handle. So you just sit your coffee, your saucer down, and everyone would grab the thing and lift it up, and all of it would go into a trough, and all the whiskey would go down the drain, and say, oh, officer, you scared me. I was just drinking my tea. And, so they would go search the place and look for the whiskey. They never found the whiskey. So where's this whiskey coming from? And they'd go down in the basement. They'd be looking around. They couldn't find the whiskey. Well, what happened was these guys were making so much money, they bought the building next door, and they bought the building on the backside 1 block away. And so late at night, they would bring in a truck, and they would unload all these barrels of whiskey a full block away, take it, and they built a tunnel underneath to the other part, to the building next door to the 21 Club, and then they built a whole wall on a hinge system. And when you went downstairs, you were looking for a button or some sort of trigger, and you opened a closet, and inside the closet there was nothing but one hanger and a metal bar, nothing in there, just an empty closet. And they look around, they knock, and nothing there. Okay. What they didn't know was there's these 2 little metal dots, 2 little contact points. You take the hanger off, and you touch the 2, and then you go click, click, and then the whole spring system would unlock, and you slide the wall away, and there's barrels of whiskey. And they would take these barrels of whiskey and roll one in for that day and just sell it and close the wall. I mean, it was the whole thing. That's where you got the term 86th. You heard that, somebody's 86th, they're out of here. That came during Prohibition. That was a speakeasy down in the lower west side of Manhattan. Well, there was the front entrance, but there was also the back entrance 1 block away, and the address was 86, whatever street it was. I was like, I forget what street it was, like Barker Street or something like that, 86 Barker Street. So it's like somebody was tip off the cops. He goes, dude, cops are coming. They're going to do a raid right now. And the bartender, oh, thanks, man. Hey, everyone, we're 86th. And everyone's like, okay, and get up and chug down their whiskey and head out the back door. The cops come in and go, it's a raid. There'd be like 2 people sitting there going, what? I'm just drinking whiskey. I'm just drinking tea or whatever. So it was a big thing. Here's the other thing. Women of good standing, these Christians, believe me, there was plenty of women who liked to get their drink on. But but prior to Prohibition, a woman in good standing would never be seen in public drinking, certainly never seen in a saloon or a hotel bar. Only hoochie coochie girls went there. The girls you didn't take home to mama, right? So they would sit there and they would drink their, but they would drink at home. And they drank a lot at home. And they could have sometimes drink in a societal function like a ball or a formal dance. But otherwise, women of good standing did not drink in public. Now Prohibition comes along. For the first time, women are forced underground and are drinking with men in public. So they had rules because women just wanted to get their drink on. They didn't want to be harassed or bothered. So the rules at a speakeasy were, first and foremost, keep your voice down, because your bar could literally be adjoined to a family or somebody above you or next to you or below you, and they would call the police if you were being too loud. So keep your voice down. So groups of 5 or less. Women could approach a man at the bar and say, "Hey, sailor, buy me a drink." That was fine. But a man was not allowed to approach a woman at the bar because maybe she was just a good, proper Christian young lady and she's just sitting there, wants to get her drink on and doesn't want to be bothered. She's not there to get picked up. She's just there to get blasted. Now, I mean, this is our history. When Prohibition was finally repealed, for the first time in history, men and women, it became socially acceptable for them to drink in public together. And I thank you ladies for that because I met my wife in a bar. So now, having said that, Prohibition went on for 13 years. It went from 1920 to 1933. And all these American bartenders fled to Europe. And then, in 1933, they finally repealed it. They did the math. They went back to the Women's Christian Temperance Society and said, "Hey, ladies, I'm sorry, but people are dying at 3 times the rate than they were before Prohibition." And the reason is because it wasn't regulated by the government and people were making really bad swill. I mean, really bad swill. People would sit there and say, "Hey man, I get a sack of flour, of wheat flour, and I just throw it in the bathtub and fill it up with water. Maybe I strip down buck naked and move around in there and let that yeast in my body help to accelerate the fermentation. Now they got a beer, they got a little tiny pot still in their kitchen. They go to some dumpster and pick up a bunch of empty bottles, fill it up and distill and make this rot gut nastiness. And they would go, and the number one selling item in pharmacies during Prohibition was juniper flavored syrup. So they put some of that syrup in there, shake it up, maybe put a label on there. Maybe it was already a label on there and they're trying to sell it as the good stuff, but they call that bathtub gin. And people were dying from it because there was a lot of methanol in there because they didn't know how to separate out the good stuff from the bad stuff, and they probably didn't even care. Think of it this way. You know, if you're I know nobody here knows, but if you were a cocaine dealer and you wanted to increase your stash, what do? What's that?
Oh, you cut it.
Yeah, you cut it. But I was waiting to see who's going to volunteer that information. So how do you know that? No, so listen, we've all seen enough CSI or whatever, you know, Miami Vice, whatever's going on. We all know that you got cocaine and you want to increase it, you cut it with stuff. Well, the thing was they're just making this nasty stuff and there was no quality or regulation controls and people were dying from bathtub gin. So in 1933, they repealed Prohibition. But all the great American bartenders were still back in Europe and they said, "Can we come home or not? Should we come home or not?" And it was just kind of like, think of it like Obamacare or think of it like any controversial piece of legislation out there right now. It's like, let's wait and see what happens with the next presidential cycle and see whether or not we can come home. And then what happened in 1939. Come on, you guys are students. Was that? World War II kicked in. World War II kicked in, and the Germans promptly bombed London and Paris, and a lot of those bartenders were either killed or scattered to the four winds. And that war ended in 1945. So the point of this whole story is this. From 1920 to 1945, we lost the art of making great cocktails. Prior to 1920, mixology was like this burgeoning thing. Being a mixologist was bartender was a proud profession. It was like a trade passed down from father to son, sometimes mother to daughter. And it was a trade like a cobbler or a pharmacist. It was a proud profession. By the time World War II ended, being a bartender became a transitional job. It was not a career, it was a job. And it was just a way to make some money while you're paying off your student loans, or you're a single mom, or you're writing the great American novel, or you're a single dad. And you're trying to just fulfill your life's ambitions and dreams, but it's just a job, way to pay the bills. We're seeing now in the last 20 years that the best bartenders are emulating the great chefs. They're sourcing local farm-to-table ingredients, they're balancing the acids and sugars, they're reducing the ethanol, and they're creating really delicious, food-friendly cocktails that are just a little higher than a glass of wine. They shouldn't make you wince. They sneak up on you. There's plenty of alcohol in there. They're not thin. They're not weak. You taste them, you go, that's delicious. That's what we want. That's the new trend. And now we're seeing, for the first time since Prohibition in the last 20 years, we're seeing that being a bartender is becoming a very proud profession again, and actually quite lucrative. I've got buddies of mine who have I have a buddy, one guy has a Harvard MBA. He does just fine for himself. And on more than one occasion, he's like, Brian, where did I go wrong, man? How do I have your job? I get to travel the world and people feed me and dine, and I get to lecture on spirits and booze. And he's like, and I make a lot more than he does. And he's like, what did I do wrong? And he's like, So I'm just saying, it's a really exciting time to be a professional bartender right now. So what I'm going to share with you, hopefully you guys are going to walk away from this and go, give it a rethink. I don't know how your parents are going to feel about that, but you guys are going to give it a think, because even if you don't want to be a bartender for the rest of your life, that's fine. But I promise you, when you do your summer cocktail parties, you guys will be making the best cocktails in town. They're like, oh, gonna be awesome tasting cocktails. All right, so the next part of this is very relevant to the South. So in 1945, the federal, they shut down the distilleries to make munitions for the war, and we lost the art of the cocktail, blah, blah, blah. But finally, in 1933, the federal government shut down and said, hey, it is now legal. It's now every American's God-given right to drink alcohol. So drink up, enjoy. They repealed Prohibition. But just because they repealed it didn't mean everybody wanted that. Just like Obamacare or some of these other controversial pieces of legislation, especially in the South, especially in the Bible Belt. And they said, in Tennessee and Georgia and Mississippi, Alabama, they were like, hey, we still want Prohibition. And just because the federal government says you can drink, we're going to pass laws to make it really hard to drink. So all these southern states got together and they started passing laws and said, okay, you're allowed to drink up, but you're not allowed to distill alcohol in our state or ferment alcohol in our state. You can't make beer or wine or distilled spirits in our state, and it's illegal to transport it across state lines. So go ahead and drink up, but you can't make it here and you can't bring it here. And of course, it gave rise to organized crime. And all of a sudden, Billy Bob back in the woods there, and he gives a bunch of corn, gets himself a copper pot still, throws some corn in some water and lets it ferment, distills this high-proof whiskey. It wasn't aged, so it was just high-proof White Lightning, and we call it White Lightning. And we drank it, and it was super high. They distill it to like 85% pure alcohol. And they put it in these white jugs, these ceramic jugs like that in the middle there. And then sometimes they put an X or 2 X's or 3 X's. Anybody know what those X's stand for? Well, people would always say how good is it or how bad it is. Not how strong it is, how many times it was distilled. And every time you distilled it, you were removing more impurities and you're getting the alcohol a little bit higher, that's true. And in the end, it's like, woo, that stuff is smooth. But it was like, put hair on your chest. If you had hair on your chest, it would take it off. Now, all of a sudden it gave rise to organized crime, and all of these good old boys were getting back in the woods and distilling from corn and making all this White Lightning. And pretty soon the cops caught on to it. Now back then, everybody had the same cars, the Ford Model V, the successor to the original Model T, the mass production car. Unless you were rich, you had that car. And everybody had that car. The bootleggers and the cops. So these guys would take their car, they'd make all this White Lightning, they'd load it up with all these heavy ceramic jugs filled with White Lightning, they'd turn off their headlights and they'd sneak into town. There's only so many paved roads back then, a lot of dirt roads, and they'd sneak into town, unload their stuff, get cash, and make another batch and making money. And the cops are like, where's all this? They're not allowed to make it here, they're not allowed to bring it here, and yet everyone's getting drunk. There's lots and lots of booze is flowing. What's going on? So they start setting up roadblocks. They start to figure out who's going on, what's happening, and they're trying to stop all this illegal distilling going on. And eventually the cops look out in the field and they say, hey, what's that smokestack doing on, on Farmer Bob's property? Well, let's get in there. And they go in the woods and grab some hound dogs. And they get deep in the woods. And sure enough, Billy Bob hears them coming a mile away. He takes off running, grabs what he can. They come across his copper pot still. They bust it open. They spill out the contents, clean it up. Billy Bob's long gone. 3 days later, he's 2 miles down the road, and he's at it again. He's built another pot still, and he's keeping the production going. So this went on for a while, and eventually the moonshiners the White Lightning producers said, this is BS. Let's just distill at nighttime so they can't see us. We're just going to distill by the light of the moon so they can't see the smoke. We're going to call that stuff moonshine. And they took that moonshine and they were starting to sell that, and they're going back and forth. And they sneak into town in their Ford Model V. Pretty soon the cops know all the ways in, and they know where to catch them and where to set up, and they got informants and all the stuff they like, just like drug dealers today. The same thing, the cops are getting all their information and trying to catch these guys. Well, the moonshiner's like, you know what? Let's get under the hood of our engine and soup up the engine of our car. It's Ford Model V. And they start outrunning the cops. The cops are like, wait a minute, we have the same car and they're outrunning us. How is that even possible? Because they're loaded down with all this heavy whiskey. So the cops get under the engine and start souping up their engines, and everyone's trying to make the fastest car they can. And pretty soon the federal government steps in and says, all right, enough. All you southern states, get in line. We said every American can not only drink whiskey, but we're going to pass a new law. Every American is allowed to transport as much alcohol across state lines as they can carry. They're not allowed to resell it, but for personal consumption, they can buy as much as they want. They can go into Alabama, buy as much, and bring it into Mississippi or wherever, and they can drink it for personal consumption. All of a sudden, all these guys who are making White Lightning and moonshine, they're out of a job. Now they can't even afford to feed their families, because now that people can just go out and buy it legal. They don't have to buy at these inflated prices that they're making. So what do these guys start doing for a living to make money?
Racing cars.
They start racing cars, and that's how NASCAR was born. All a stock car, because everyone had the same car, and you had to make that engine as fast as you could. All the original NASCAR drivers, all of them used to run White Lightning or Hooch during and after Prohibition. If you don't believe me, watch, what is that, Talladega Nights? Ricky Bobby. Remember that? Is this interesting?
Yeah.
I mean, it's part of our history. By the way, I'm not a history professor. I know you guys are college students. He's like, another lecture. But I'm telling you guys, I'm not a professor. I'm just a guy who really loves the histories and the stories here. Why am I telling you guys these stories? How is that relevant to mixology and everything else? Well, for one thing, your guests love to hear these stories. And you don't have to memorize all of them, but if one or two of them stick with you and you can throw that into a conversation, when you're talking about gin or bourbon or whiskey or anything like that, that's cool. People love to hear these stories. So, something strikes you as like interesting, go ahead and write it down. All right, let's talk about booze. First of all, when we distill a spirit, every spirit comes off the still clear. Let me say that again. Every spirit comes off of the still clear. Campari, Bailey's Irish Cream, dark rum, light rum, Midori, whatever it is, whiskey, it all comes off the still clear. And what we do to it after distillation, what we add to it or do to it after distillation ultimately determines its color and to a large extent its flavor as well. And one of the ways that we can transform the flavor or the color of a spirit is by putting it in oak and aging it in oak barrels. Why oak as opposed to any other wood? There are several spirits around the world, like in cachaça in Brazil is aged in rainforest woods, which are very hard. But the reason we like oak is because it's very porous. It breathes. It's watertight, but it's not airtight. And so it allows the spirit to, as daytime, nighttime, summertime, winter, it expands and contracts and it breathes. And when we make a barrel, there are 35 staves. We put them together. We toast or char the inside of the barrel. We toast it in order to make those staves malleable so we can bend them. And the reason those barrels are curved is so that when we're taking it down the gangplank and loading it onto a ship, we can navigate corners. Otherwise, if the ship was over here and there was an L-shaped dock, I'd have to go roll it down here, pick it up, put it down. But if I have it curved, I can just kind of navigate the corners. And so the way that we make those barrels curved is by charring or toasting the inside of the wood. And then it becomes warm and malleable, and now we can bend it into a curve. We get 35 stabs, we make this charred barrel, and then we can put stuff in it. And back in the day, barrels were king. That's how you transported everything. It's how you transported fruits and vegetables. It's how you transported gunpowder. It's how you transported any needs. You didn't have glass, you didn't have plastic, so everything was transported in barrels. And it's certainly how you transported wine and spirits. And back in the day when they had sherry or Madeira, they would put it in these barrels and they'd go on these long sea journeys. By the time they got to where they were going, they'd open it up and the clear Fino sherry had turned brown. And they go, oh man, is this stuff any good? They taste it and they go, I'm getting my drink on, and by golly, that tastes really yummy. And the reason is because when we found out ethanol is a solvent. It dissolves oils. And so when we have a charred barrel, this black toasted char on the inside of the barrel, as it breathes daytime and nighttime, summertime and wintertime, or if it's in the bow of a ship where it's sloshing up and down, the ethanol goes into the pores of that oak. And it dissolves those oils and some of that char and some of those sugars that are in the wood and slowly incorporates it back into the spirit as it expands and contracts, as it breathes. It's watertight, but it's not airtight. Now I'm about to blow your mind. Some of you guys, some of you not. The only difference between vodka and whiskey, for all intents and purposes, the only real difference between vodka and whiskey is that whiskey is aged in an oak barrel. All whiskeys start off as vodka. That's how profound an influence that aging in a barrel has. Because no one would ever suggest that whiskey tastes or looks anything like vodka. But over time, it usually takes about 2 years minimum to get that golden brown, sweet liquor that we have come to know as whiskey. And that's just from barrel aging. And the longer we age it, and the thicker the char, the more color extraction, the more flavor we're getting out of it. Some people deliberately do a light toast because they want it's like slow cooking. They think it's better to age over a longer period of time. Jack Daniels does it in 3 years with a thick char. They're getting as much color extraction, as much flavor, as much sugar as they can out of it in the shortest period of time possible. Doesn't mean it's bad, it just means it's a different process. So just want to keep that in mind. Now other spirits like Campari and or Madeira, or let's just say creme de cacao, they're adding sugars and all sorts of colors. Madeira definitely has a green food coloring added. So they're getting their colors and flavors after distillation. Most of those spirits are done on a column or continuous still, so you have neutral spirit, and then they add colors and flavors, and then you have your final distillate. But the best spirits are just aged in a barrel and just have that natural flavor from the char from the oak. All right. So, behind every bar in the world, there are 6 spirits that comprise 95% of every cocktail ordered. We're going to call them our base spirits. Now, there's many different base spirits, but if I ordered a Campari and soda, obviously my base spirit is Campari. But these 6 base spirits in particular comprise 95% of every cocktail you're ever going to get ordered behind the bar. Things are changing and people are starting to order more esoteric things like mezcal. You're seeing more like that. But these 6 are the big ones. What's number 1?
Vodka.
Sure. And by the way, who can tell me what the number 1 spirit consumed in the world per capita is? Any idea? What's that? Tequila? No. It's a fast, huge growing category, but it's really this much of the total market. And tequila, Blanco tequila, white tequila, is the fastest growing spirit category amongst women right now because it's got flavor, tastes good, and agave nectar is relatively low in calories. By the way, that's good for guys too. Guys drink Blanco tequila, and it's got a lot of flavor in it too, so sorry. Guys, anything I said about men and women and prohibition, I'm just telling you history. I'm not a misogynistic pig. I've got a 5.5-year-old daughter. Women's lib. I love you guys. Please, equal rights, equal pay. Yay. Okay, so I'm relaying history. So please give me the benefit of the doubt on that one. All right, now, vodka. The number one spirit consumed in the world per capita is actually baijiu. You're like, what is baijiu? Kind of like a cross between sake and vodka. It's usually between 9% and 54% alcohol by volume, depending on who's making it. Predominantly made, there's sochu and soju. Soju is made in Korea and sochu is made in Japan. But either way, it's widely made all throughout the Asian Pacific Rim. Did I say baijiu or soju? Okay, baijiu. Is made in mainland China. It's also found in Thailand and Cambodia and Vietnam and Malaysia. It's all the Asian Pacific Rim, and they drink a lot of it. Baijiu is predominantly made with wheat and sorghum, but they make this like whiskey, and they use 120 different mold and bacteria. All that stuff's killed during distillation, but it has all kinds of flavor in it. And so this stuff is funky and weird, and Americans are usually not down with it. But it's the number one spirit consumed in the world per capita. And it's coming around. Don't be surprised in 20 years if you start seeing it in bars right here in Mississippi. Don't be surprised. It's coming. All right, vodka. What's besides vodka? Give me another white spirit. Gin, of course, gin. And we're going to talk about the difference between vodkas and gin. What else? Tequila, sure. Well, I would say rum and tequila, sure. Rum, tequila. What else? Whiskey. And whiskey is all-encompassing. That includes bourbon, scotch, rye, and all the other kinds of whiskeys out there, which we're going to talk about today. And then what else? Hey, well done. Not everyone gets that one. Brandy. And that includes cognac and Calvados and Armagnac and this thing called eau de vie, which we'll talk about in a bit. So we're going to spend the rest of the day talking about these 6 base spirits and the different brands and the stories behind them. And I encourage you guys to ask questions because they're really interesting stuff. All right, so what is vodka anyhow? When I ask you what is vodka made from, what I'm asking you is think back to our beer. We know it has water, we know it has yeast, but it has to have some source of sugar. That's the raw material used to make sugar in order to make our distilled spirit, our beer, before distillation. So, just to recap, we need water, yeast, and sugar. Yeast eats the sugar, turns into ethanol alcohol. We have a beer, we add heat, the vapors rise up, we collect them and cool down, and a copper pot still 85% alcohol, and a column still 96% alcohol. So the question is, what is vodka made from? What's the raw material used to make vodka?
Neutral grains.
Who said potatoes? Okay. It's interesting, and I ask this question all the time, and always somebody says potatoes. Of all the vodka that's made in the world every year, this much is potato vodka. This much. I don't know why. I do know why. It's because the Russians and the Poles are always fighting over who invented vodka. And we think the original vodka, right now it's tipping towards the Russians in the 12th century. We think we're making vodka from sugar beets. But certainly the Poles have been making vodka from potatoes and a lot of that. But the only one you've ever even heard of probably is Chopin. Is a Polish vodka made from potatoes. Maybe you've heard of Luxasova, but probably not. You have? Okay, good man. So can you think of any other potato vodkas? I can't. What is most vodka made from? Neutral grains. We're going to say neutral grains. And that's very important. So there are 4 major neutral grains, and you should probably know what they are. Anyone want to guess what they are? The big 4 are going to be wheat, and wheat is king. The vast majority of vodka consumed in the world per capita is made with wheat. That's Smirnoff, that's Stolichnaya, that's Absolute, that's Kettle One, and Grey Goose. All of those bad boys are made from wheat. So, and that's because wheat is very soft and doesn't have a tremendous amount of flavor, and it really lends to vodka, which is very neutral, odorless, colorless, flavorless. But it does have flavor. Because no one would ever suggest that corn tastes like wheat or wheat tastes like rye. So a corn vodka tastes very different than a wheat vodka. And so when you really taste them side by side, you'll notice those differences. Wheat is far and away the king of grains. What else you got? Barley. Can anybody think of a barley vodka? You ever heard of Finlandia? You guys are so young, you haven't even heard of Finlandia. It was hugely popular in the 90s and a little bit in the 2000s, but guys are probably, yeah, I'm sure most of you guys weren't drinking back then, so Finlandia is out of there. That's made in Finland. What else? Corn. Can anybody name me a corn vodka?
It's your well vodka.
Tito's. Where's Tito's made?
Texas.
In Texas. Where in Texas? Keeping it weird. Austin, Texas. Now, how many times is it distilled? What's that? Triple distilled? Nope, not quite. Anybody else? Distilled 6 times. 6 times. Where's my bottle of Tito's? Now, most vodkas are done in a copper pot or column still because it distills to 96%. Is Tito's done in a copper pot still or a column still?
Copper pot.
How do you know that? Because there's a big copper pot right on the label. In the back here, there's this whole story. It talks about it's made in Austin, Texas, from 100% corn. It's gluten-free, distilled 6 times, done in a copper pot alembic still, 40% alcohol by volume. Boom. Read your labels. There's so much interesting information. Now that I've given you the vocabulary, now between pot still and column still, between your raw materials, now you can actually understand what's in these things and what makes it good and bad. Can anybody else think of a copper pot alembic still vodka? Distilled 3 times. From Holland. What is a kettle? It's a giant pot still, right? I've been to Kettle One. I've shoveled coal in this still, the #1 copper pot still. And it's made in Amsterdam. In Holland, rather. Not in Amsterdam, it's in Holland. And is made by Bob Noylet. The Noylet family has been making distilled spirits for 13 generations. But before they making vodka, they were actually making Genever, which is like a precursor to gin. If you go to Holland and you say, what do you think about Kettle One? And they go, oh, Kettle One's the best. I've been drinking Kettle One all my life. And you go, yeah, that's a heck of a good vodka, right? And they go, Kettle One makes a vodka? And you're going, Kettle One vodka? And you're going, Kettle One doesn't make vodka, they make Genever. And you go, no, they make vodka. Well, make no mistake about it, Kettle One makes a heck of a lot more vodka, but most of it's for export to Europe and to the United States. But in Holland, they drink Genever, which is like a malted barley wine, and they distill that and they make this kind of like a precursor, this botanically driven, it's kind of like a funky gin, is the best way to describe it. It's kind of like a cross between an unaged whiskey and gin, which we'll describe in a minute. So now we know Kettle One is made in Holland, distilled 3 times, from wheat. What does Belvedere mean? What does the word Belvedere mean? Anybody know? Where's Belvedere made? Poland. It's a Polish vodka. Bravo. Anybody know what it's made from?
Rye.
Ah, yeah, my last grain. Yeah, rye. That is exactly right. Who said rye? Good job, good job. It's made from rye. Distilled how many times?
6 to 3.
4. Split the difference. Distilled 4 times. And the word Belvedere means beautiful to see in Poland, in Polish. And it is also the name of the presidential palace in Warsaw, Poland. Hence, we have that palace behind there with the white tree surrounding it. That's the Belvedere. Distilled 4 times from rye, 40% alcohol by volume, Polish rye vodka. How do I know that? Am I just a nerd who goes and Googles everything all day long? Yes, it's true. But I also read my labels. All that information is right there on the label for you to read. A lot of interesting, read your labels. Grey Goose. Where is it made? What country? Italy, anybody else? France. Good guess. Close. France. Made from winter wheat. Distilled in a copper pot still or a column still? Distilled in a column or continuous still. Here's the real question. How many times is Grey Goose distilled? What's that? Who said that? Once. That is correct. Once. Distilled one time in a column or continuous still. And you're welcome to say, wait a minute, does that mean it's a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the more we distill it, the more impurities removing and the more clean the spirit is, the more neutral it is. But by distilling it one time, even at 96% alcohol by volume, we're still retaining some. We still have 4% of the raw material, so we can still taste some of the flavor in it. So, arguably, Grey Goose has more flavor than most column distilled vodkas. But to be candid about it, it's not particularly great vodka. So if you like Grey Goose, by all means, it's not bad vodka. I just don't think it's particularly great vodka, in my professional opinion. But if you like it, go for it. And by the way, I'm teaching you all this stuff. We're not here to teach our guests this stuff unless they open the door. So if somebody's like talking to his girlfriend, he's like going, I tell you, man, Grey Goose is the bomb. It is the best vodka. There is nothing better than Grey Goose. I only drink Grey Goose. You go, you know, Brian Van Flandern says that Tito's, half the cost, much better. Don't do that. You're going to shame the guy in front of his girlfriend. He spent his money, he came in here. Obviously, you guys are smarter than that. But the point is, the guy comes into your bar and says, man, I love Grey Goose. I only drink Grey Goose. That's my favorite vodka. What's your favorite? Now he just opened the door. But you're not going to tell him why Grey Goose is bad. You're just going to tell him why Tito's is good. You can sit there and say, you know what? I know it costs less money, but Tito's is distilled in Austin, Texas, and they do it in a number 10 size copper pot alembic still. And it's made from 100% corn. It's gluten-free. Doesn't give me the headache. And it's got a lot more flavor. Get all that corn sweetness. And, and the price is cheaper. I prefer the guy, at the very least, he's going to be like, yeah, I respect that. I mean, you just dropped a lot of knowledge on him, and he's going to be like, this guy obviously knows what he's talking about. This woman obviously knows what she's talking about. Clearly, I can still love my Grey Goose, but maybe I should give Tito's a try. So anyway, obviously we want to selling the premium spirits. So if the guy wants to buy Grey Goose, let him buy his Grey Goose, right? Yeah. All right. By the way, great story about Grey Goose. French vodka, winter wheat, distilled one time. There was a guy named Sidney Frank. He was an American, and he was the importer of Grey Goose. Because back then, nobody had this tall, frosted bottle. Now, Belvedere, tall, frosted bottles are rather common nowadays. But back then, he was the first one, and is the world's first ultra-premium vodka. The world's first premium vodka was Absolut from Sweden, done from winter wheat, done in a column or continuous still, but circulated hundreds of times. This one was done in this super tall bottle, and they charged a premium, and they called it Grey Goose, and everybody wanted it. And it ticked off every bar manager and bar owner because they had to raise up their bar shelves an extra 2 inches because it was extra tall. No other bottle was that tall, and so they had to raise up their bar shelves, and everybody wanted it. And Sidney Frank marketed the heck out of this, and people loved it. And he did such a good job, he sold it to Bacardi for $1 billion. And he retired. And his only other product, he had Cristal Champagne, Grey Goose, and another obscure Amaro, this German liqueur called Jägermeister. You might have heard of that one too. And he brought these three things into the United States and was marketing the heck out of them. just a genius marketer. Sold Grey Goose, sold the company for $1 billion to Bacardi. They bought the whole portfolio, and he got his whole staff together, like, you know, all you're here right now. And he said, okay, everybody, I got good news and bad news. The bad news is I just sold the company, and I am out. The good news is that I talked to Bacardi, and some of you guys still have jobs. So you're going to have your job, and don't worry about that. But I want to thank you all for all your years of dedication and service. And he called up his personal secretary, and he goes, now, her name, I can't remember her name. He goes, she had been with him for 35 years. He goes, I just want to thank you for 35 years of service. And he cut her a check for $35 million. And he handed out massive checks to all of his other employees. Most of them left. There's a new kid who had just started 6 weeks earlier. And he said, hey, listen, I'm sorry, we sold to Bacardi. I'm not sure you're going to have a job or not. That's up to them to decide. But just for, you know, you've only been here 6 weeks, but here's 15 grand just to, you know, tie you over to get your next job. He's like, oh, okay. I mean, I'd take 15 grand, sure, why not? So anyway, as the story goes, years later, he loved to fly private jets. He wouldn't fly, he owned private jets, and he liked to fly around the world and travel. This is many years later after he sold the company. He had a great life, and as the legend goes, he got onto his private jet, popped a bottle of Cristal champagne, poured himself a glass, took a sip, set it down, and died. And it sounds terrible, right? That's how I want to go. I want to go that way. So I want to write that screenplay and sell it to Hollywood. I think it's a great story. The whole story. Can you imagine? It's like, I don't know, getting that check for $35 million. You can imagine the expression on her face. So, all right. So listen, my point of all of this is that every single one of these spirits has a story behind them. Read your labels. Pick up your labels. And I challenge you again. Nobody wants homework. You guys are all college students. My challenge to you is, if you want, no one's keeping score, and no one's going to test you, and no one's going to come back at you. My suggestion, especially for my bartenders, tomorrow, come back and tell everybody else something about one of these bottles behind the bar that you did not know yesterday, because you picked up the bottle and you read it and say, hey, that's on a pot still. Hey, this is made in Ireland. Hey, this is made from wheat or corn or barley or rye, or it's made from agave or whatever it is. Tell us something new that you didn't know about a spirit. And you find it's kind of infectious. It's kind of cool. And especially if you're slow, pick up a bottle and read it. It's interesting stuff. All right. Oh, okay, here we go. So that's vodka. Any other vodkas you want to know about? How about gin? What's the difference between, what is okay, so we talk about vodka, gin, tequila, rum. What is gin made from? Okay, so, good. But I'm going to get back to my original question, which is, when I ask you what a spirit's made from, I want to know what's the raw material. Vodka can be made, like in the case of Ciroc, it can be made from snap frost grapes. It can be made from tapioca pearls. It can be made from just about anything. It can be made from bison grass, but the big four are the neutral grains of barley, wheat, corn, and rye. And it certainly can be made from potatoes as well. And is. There are some great potato vodkas out there. But that's the raw material. Sorry, puberty. That's the raw material that we're using to make vodka. So when I ask you what a spirit's made from, I want to know, where's the source of sugar? What's the raw material used to make vodka? In the case of vodka, it is neutral grains that are starchy, and we unlock those starch granules into glucose. What about gin? Yes, who said that? Yes, it's the same thing. It's made from barley, wheat, corn, or rye. Nobody ever told you this. Vodka and gin are the same thing. The only difference is that vodka is usually cut to a higher percentage. Most vodkas are cut to 40% alcohol by volume, and most gins are cut to 43 to 47 or 49% alcohol by volume. We decide what percentage it's cut to, so that's a choice. After we distill it to 85 or 96% alcohol, we take distilled water and we cut it down to the percentage of alcohol that we want in the bottle. And in the case of gin, it's a little higher at 43 to 49% alcohol. And then we flavor it with botanicals. What is a botanical? A botanical is a flavoring agent that does not contribute significantly to the sugar in our beer. When we make our beer before distillation, we throw all that stuff together. The botanical doesn't have much sugar in it, but it has a lot of flavor. And botanicals can be lemon peels or orange peels, cardamom, cassia bark. It can be cucumbers and rose petals. It could be cinnamon or coriander or grains of paradise. Anything that has a lot of flavor, not necessarily a lot of sugar. There is one botanical that all gins have to have. If it doesn't have this one botanical, it cannot be called gin. It's called a flavored vodka. What is that one botanical? Somebody said it earlier. Juniper. That's what these little berries are down here in the lower right-hand corner. Those are juniper berries. And if you don't know what a juniper berry smells like or tastes like, just pick up a bottle of a Tanqueray, pass that around, because this is a very juniper-forward gin. And that doesn't smell like any vodka you ever smelled. It smells like pine cones in the sea. You ever seen that new vodkas called Kettle One Botanicals? Those are flavored vodkas using often the same botanicals as gin, only they're not using juniper. They're using other botanicals, and they're making this like cucumber and mint. And they're making a vodka, a flavored vodka with botanicals. And the trend is getting away from all these artificial flavors. We're getting away from the marshmallow fluff and the whipped cream and the Fruit Loops vodka and the peanut butter and jelly vodka. Although peanut butter whiskey is pretty hot right now. Screwball whiskey, that's pretty hot. Flavored vodkas and flavored whiskeys are coming on the scene hard right now, but everyone's trending towards more natural flavors and getting away from the artificial, compounded, high fructose corn syrup and artificial flavors. That's the trend. So, all right. Gin. What's the difference between Bombay and Bombay Sapphire? Anybody want to take a guess? Who said that? Yeah, sure. So Bombay is done in a column or continuous still, and Bombay Sapphire is done in a copper pot still. Bombay is done with dried botanicals, which are very concentrated flavors. Bombay Sapphire uses fresh botanicals. After distilling in a copper pot still, they actually, as the vapors come off, it goes through a separate compression chamber with a copper basket and fresh botanicals in there, and those heated vodka vapors pass through the compression chamber, and they heat up those botanicals and they strip away the oils, and those oils are imprinted onto those vodka vapors, and it comes out gin. Because they're putting in fresh botanicals, including juniper, so it comes out this very soft, very muted style of gin. Bombay Sapphire, to me, is the vodka lover's gin. It is a very soft, muted style of gin. Still, even at that soft style, it's still 47% alcohol by volume. So if somebody comes and asks for a vodka soda or a gin and soda, or a gin and tonic and a vodka tonic, and you pour them the same amount of vodka and gin, you're pouring 7% more alcohol. They're going to get 7% drunker. So anybody who's ever said, who here has ever had a bad experience with gin? Okay, just two. Okay, two honest guys here. Now, for the rest of you, the question is, you had a bad experience with gin. Have you ever said, oh, I won't drink gin, I only drink vodka? Why? Ethanol is ethanol is ethanol. It gets you just as drunk in vodka or gin. The only question is, how much gin are you drinking? And the reason, if you drink really bad tequila or really bad gin, and you get that flavor in your mouth, it has got a lot of flavor in it, and then you get a wicked headache because you drank too much. The next morning you wake up and you go, oh, and I can taste it. That's why we don't like gin, or we think we don't like gin. Over the next couple of days, I'm going to make you guys some great gin cocktails. And I love converting people back to gin. People say, I don't drink gin. Let me make you a cocktail. Taste that. Oh my gosh, that's delicious. What is that? Gin. Because I just use less of it. And instead of an ounce and a half, I use an ounce and a quarter or even an ounce. And I'll balance it out, and they taste it, and they can taste all those botanicals without going, You'll have to twist your leg because you're like, ugh. So we're making a great balanced cocktail. Tanqueray, on the other hand, is very juniper forward, and they put it right in the still. And they put in a lot of grapefruit peels and citrus peels and all these other wonderful botanicals. On the gin rainbow, it's a beautiful arc of beautiful gins, of everything in between, Hendrix and Bulldog and everything in between. Bombay Sapphire is at one end of this beautiful rainbow. Great, well-made, soft, muted style vodka lover's gin. On the other end is Tanqueray, and it is in your face, juniper forward, gin lover's gin. So much so that Tanqueray 10 won in the San Francisco Spirits Awards in a blind tasting with at least 40 other vodkas and 20 judges, scoring, nosing, tasting. Tanqueray 10 won 3 years in a row, blind. Blind. They finally said, you won, you're retired, you don't get to compete anymore, you got the hat trick, congratulations, you're done. Guess who won the 4th year? Tanqueray. It is the gin lover's gin. It is flavor. It's a lot of juniper right in your face. These are great spirits. So what's the difference between Tanqueray and Tanqueray 10? Anybody know? What's that? So let me ask another question. What does the 10 in Tanqueray 10 stand for? So is gin aged? If it was aged, it would have color to it, and it's clear. There are some aged gins, but it's rare and they're very unusual. You don't see them very often. Very unusual. So no, it does not refer to the number of years it's aged. Not aged. Distilled 10 times, the second most common answer I hear. Distilled 10 times, good guess, no. Good guess though, it was a good guess. What else?
The 10 botanicals.
The third most common answer I hear is 10 botanicals. There's no reason you guys should be able to guess this. The answer is because it is distilled in a number 10 sized copper pot alembic still. It's a smaller sized pot still, but they're using fresh botanicals. Tanqueray 10, fresh botanicals in a pot still. Tanqueray, dried botanicals in a column or continuous still. Okay? What makes Hendrix so special and so unique? And cucumbers and rose petals. Hendrix has a whole bunch of different botanicals in there. You could probably look at the bottle and figure all of them out. But what makes it unique is it has rose petals and cucumbers. Does it have juniper in it? It has to. It can't be called gin if it doesn't have juniper in it. So yes. Now there's different styles of gin. There's London Dry, which is done and is a very dry style. American gins tend to be much softer on the juniper. There's juniper in there, but they balance out. You can taste other things. Can you name an American style gin that's very popular? Say Monkey 47. And Monkey 47, by the way, in the middle? Thank you. Who knows why is Monkey 47 called, what's the 47 refer to? The pot?
Recipes it took to
Is pot even legal here?
No,
In Mississippi? It'd be cool if they did a pot gin. And by the way, they've already made some. There's
Like the pot. It was,
oh, the pot still. I knew that. I just messing with them. All right, so who can tell me what's the 47 stand for in Monkey 47? 47 botanicals. It was made in 1947. That's some old gin, but it's not. It's actually 47 different botanicals. That's a lot of botanicals. Who know? I mean, that's most gins have about 8 to 12, sometimes more, sometimes less. But 47, that's a lot. Also, it's 47% alcohol by volume. So Monkey 47. There's a whole story back here. You should read the story about Monkey 47. Fascinating stuff. And who knows where it's made? Who knows what country it's made in? It is not made in America. It's a product of Germany, made in Germany. It's a German gin.
that's like a top-notch gin, right?
It is a top-notch gin, and it is done more of a London Dry style. But my question was, can you guys name an American-style gin that's very popular? I'll give you their super big hint.
Wonderberg,
Wonderberg is, where is that made?
Mississippi.
Okay. Oh, Wonderberg, yeah. So I'm unfamiliar with this, but I'm learning all about it just by reading the label. About the gin, using the name Mississippi Rice-Based Spirit. It's made from rice. It's a rice-based gin. Love that. Our award-winning flagship gin. This is the first ever issuance of our experimental series featuring the delicate essence of locally harvested southern magnolia petals. They have magnolia petals. So what's it made from? It's made from rice. That's the raw material. That's the sugar source. Then what makes it special? Well, they're using magnolia petals in addition to juniper and other botanicals. Interesting. I just learned something new. I love it. You guys ever heard of Aviation Gin? That's Ryan Reynolds. He sold out. He no longer owns it. But I knew Aviation was being made in Oregon. And I lived there for like 3 seconds, hot second. Wife number one, I left her back there. But I will tell you that Oregon makes this American-style gin called Aviation. You know what really kills me? I could have owned a piece of that because I knew the guy who was making it. I could have owned a piece of Aviation gin, and then Ryan Reynolds got it, and I was like, oh. That's not even my worst story. My worst story is that I wrote a book called Tequila Cocktails and I wrote it with Randy Gerber and George Clooney. Now, George, they own Casamigos Tequila, so they sponsored the book, and Randy Gerber wrote the foreword, and George gave me a bunch of photos to put in there of him in the agave fields. And I was in negotiations to own 0.01% of Casamigos, 0.01%. And all of a sudden they went radio silent on me. And I was like going, it's like, what happened? I thought we were buds. What happened? And they called me up about 6 months later and said, hey, Brian, just want to let you know we're really sorry. Things didn't work out. Appreciate the book. My book's on George Clooney's coffee table. We'll still work with you in the future, but just so you know, we just sold the brand to Diageo for $1 billion. It's way after Grey Goose was sold for $1 billion. It was about 5 or 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. Anybody? What's 0.01% of $1 billion?
100,000.
It's 1 million. $1 million. $1 million. Ah. But I still love Casamigos. It's good tequila. We'll talk about that in a bit. All right, so gin. I'll leave you with a quick story about gin, and then we're going to move on. You guys know the history of the gin and tonic? The history of the gin and tonic. There was a Jesuit priest who discovered in Venezuela that the natives, and sometime around the 1600s, they were chewing on the bark of this tree. And so he went ahead and tried some, and he goes, this tastes terrible. It's really bitter. He goes, why do you guys do that? And they said, because it prevents the malaria parasite from reproducing. Of course, they didn't say the malaria parasite. They were just like going, it prevents malaria. And they said, and back then, in the 1600s, anywhere there was stagnant water, there was mosquitoes. Anywhere there was mosquitoes, you could get malaria. Even to this day, in 2022, over 3 million people die all around the world every year from malaria. So back then, London, Paris, there was pools of water, there was mosquitoes. You could be in the fanciest, richest person in the world, but if you got bit by a mosquito, you could get malaria, which get a fever, it spiked, it stays with you for the rest of your life. A fever can flare up later, years later. You get malaria, you die. It's a parasite. It just reproduces and grows, and eventually you get this fever. This bark was from the cinchona tree, and the cinchona bark actually prevented the malaria parasite from reproducing. And it was a modern medical miracle. And this Jesuit priest brought it back to the UK. And as the United Kingdom started colonizing the rest of the world, specifically parts of North Africa and India, they would plant this tree everywhere. And they would take the bark of the tree, they would shave it off, they would grind it into this bitter red earthy powder, like that color. They'd put it into a glass, put some sugar in there so it wasn't so bitter. Take a soda siphon and fill it up with soda water, stir it all together, and make a medicinal beverage called a tonic. And the tonics, the British sailors would drink these tonics, and the British soldiers would drink these tonics to prevent malaria. Now, the British sailors also had to worry about scurvy because they had very poor diets back then, and scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency. We have much more diverse diets today, and the human body doesn't produce vitamin C, so you only need a couple oranges a year, you'll be fine. I mean, you just have to get a little bit of vitamin C, and you'll be fine. But back in the day, they mostly ate dried bread and dried meat, and so every time the British sailors pulled into a port of call, they would stock up on lemons and limes and oranges and grapefruits, any kind of citrus they could get hold of. And even to this day, British sailors are called limeys. And these limeys would make these tonics with rum or tonics with gin, because they said, if we have to drink these god-awful tonics to prevent malaria, let's put some gin in it or put some rum in it, and they would drink them, and then they would squeeze some fresh lime in there, and that would prevent scurvy and malaria. So that's the history of this gin and tonic. Great story, now you know. And by the way, a little footnote for that, in case for those of you who have happened to see it in the grocery stores. When they planted the tree in India, the native Indian people had a very difficult time saying the word cinchona. And as they distilled that cinchona bark down, the Brits later called it quinine or quinine powder, which is why your soda gun has a Q for tonic water. That's quinine powder. That's that bark that they distilled and put into the tonic water. And if you've ever seen it in the stores, the Indian people, the people of India, who couldn't pronounce cinchona very well, because it was a British colony at the time, and the British had come in and colonized India. Instead, they called it, there's the cinchona bark right there. That's what it's going to look like. We're going to make our own house-made tonic water. It's going to taste just like that. It's going to be yummy and delicious. And we're going to find out that cinchona bark, they couldn't pronounce the word cinchona, so instead they just said it prevented the malaria fever, so they renamed it the fever tree. You ever heard of fever tree tonic water? Fever tree ginger ale, fever tree, you ever heard of fever tree brand? That's why it's called fever tree. It's like, little dots going ting, 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 connections. Cool stuff. All right, that's the history of gin. So let's learn about whiskey. Guys, lock and load, because this isn't going to take long, but for the next 20 minutes, half an hour, we're going to blast you with a lot of whiskey information. And when you're done, you're going to know more than most bartenders in the world about the different whiskeys behind your bar. And it's going to be interesting. So let's get into it. First of all, there are two different spellings of whiskey. In case you never noticed it, nobody ever pointed it out, you just never paid attention. There are two different spellings. There's whiskey with an E and whiskey without. The Irish pretty much invented whiskey. They got the jump on Scotland by about 100 years. So the Irish, the original Gaelic spelling was with an E. But Ireland is right next to Scotland, and people moved back and forth between the countries, and there weren't a lot of dictionaries back then. So back then, some people spelled it with an E, some people spelled it without an E. It was kind of a hodgepodge. We do know that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, in all of their papers, they actually wrote whiskey with an E, which is the Irish spelling. We think it's because there's a lot of Irish immigrants that came to the United States in those early days. And so that was the common spelling. And so, And so the United States and Ireland are the only ones in the world who continue to spell it with an E. Everybody else spells it without, because everybody else is trying to emulate the Scotch style of whiskey. There is, however, one single American whiskey, a bourbon in fact, that somehow got by the TTB, and they spell it without an E, and they weren't caught, and they were grandfathered in. So the TTB has allowed them to continue to spell their bourbon without an E. And when I wrote a book called Whiskey Cocktails, I called up the master distiller and said, "Why do you do that?" And the guy said, "Because my father was a great master distiller, and my mother was born in Ireland and raised in Scotland, and she always spelled it without an E, and she designed the label, and she was a headstrong woman, and my father didn't have the heart to argue with her, so he was like, okay, honey." So that's the reason why. Can anybody guess what whiskey that is? Yeah, Maker's Mark.
There's a bottle right behind you.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
No, he was formed by some bourbon guys,
Okay, yeah. So Maker's Mark is without an E, and that's the reason why, in case you ever wonder. Let's look at this. The toughest column is the first column, and after we get past that, it's going to get much faster, much easier. So in America, we have this particular type of whiskey called a bourbon. So here's the rules on bourbon. A bourbon, common question. Can a bourbon be made outside of the state of Kentucky?
Yep.
Yes.
Absolutely yes. Where is bourbon allowed to be made throughout the world?
America.
Exclusively in the United States of America. It can be made in any of the 50 states, but it has to follow the following rules. 1, it must be made in the United States. Number 2, it must have at least 51% or more corn in the mash bill. What's a mash bill? That's our beer. So we have our big pot of water and we add all of our grains and we add our yeast and we let it eat up the sugar and turn it into alcohol before distillation. The mash bill is basically our recipe. In the case of bourbon, it has to have at least 51% or more corn in the mash bill, but it may not exceed 80%. Between 51 and 80% corn. The rest is up to the master distiller, is some combination of wheat or barley or rye. Tom Bullitt's Tom Bullitt's bourbon I think is 60% corn and 40% rye. That's a high percentage of rye. But you'll have others that do 5% malted barley and 7% wheat and the rest is corn. So there's all kinds of different recipes out there. All right, that's what makes one of the reasons it makes one bourbon different from the next one. Okay, if it's aged, in order to be called a straight bourbon, what's that?
4 years, isn't it?
That's bottled and bond, but we're going to get to that. To be called a straight bourbon, it must be aged for a minimum of 2 years in 100% brand new white American oak casks. Must be brand new white American oak casks. Now that means every 2 years, the bourbon industry turns over thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of barrels, and they're not allowed to reuse those barrels and call it bourbon. Now that's not sustainable, and eventually they're going to have to change the laws because we're cutting down more oak than we're planting. We're planting at a furious pace, but it's not sustainable. The question is, what do we do with all those used bourbon barrels because we're not allowed to reuse them and call it bourbon? What do we do with them? Say what?
Do some rye. You could age other alcohol.
Sure. Yes, we sell them to Mexico because there's not a lot of oak trees in Mexico, right? So we sell our used bourbon barrels down to Mexico for the aging of great tequila. We sell them down all throughout the Caribbean and Latin and Central America for the aging of great rums. We sell them to Ireland and to Scotland because there's not a lot of oak trees in Ireland or Scotland. And so they buy American oak barrels, reclaimed American white bourbon barrels, and they age their great Irish and Scotch whiskeys in reclaimed American bourbon casks. Okay, so those rules. There's some other rules as well, but those are the big ones. It must be 51% to 80% corn, and it must be aged for a minimum of 2 years to be called a straight bourbon. If it's aged for 4 years or more in a bonded warehouse, then we can call that bourbon a bonded bourbon. And that means it's in a bonded government warehouse. A government official, they put a tax seal over the top of the barrel, and no one's allowed to break that seal. If the seal's broken, that bottle, you can call it whatever you want, but you can't call it bonded bourbon. But once it's bonded, then we know that that's been aged a minimum of 4 years. So it's been called a small batch bourbon. A small batch bourbon has no legal definition. It really doesn't mean anything except that the master distiller had some leftover stuff or was experimenting and playing around and came up with a new recipe and said, hey, this is pretty good. Let's make smaller, say 4 Roses. They have their single barrel and they have their regular yellow label, but they have a small batch. Well, they came up with an alternate recipe. Maybe it was interesting or this and that, had some leftover stuff. Who knows? Whatever, everybody's story is different. But he just called it small batch, and they sell it for a premium really doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean it's bad, doesn't necessarily mean it's good either. And then we come to this last category of bourbon called a single barrel bourbon, not to be confused with single malt scotch, a very different thing. So, what makes one bourbon different from another bourbon? 4 things. Number 1, the mash bill. Now we said it has to have 51% or more corn, but less than 80%. But then it's some combination of wheat, barley, and rye. So everybody's got their own recipe. That's number 1. Number 2, the length of aging. To be a straight bourbon, it has to be a minimum of 2 years or a bonded 4 years, but it could be any length of aging. So minimum 2 years. Most people do 2 years, some do more. 3, the char of the barrel. When we char or toast the inside of the barrel, there are 4 different thicknesses of char, from a light toast to a thick char. Some people use a 3 char, some people use a 2 char, 4 char, and some people blend a 2 and a 4 char. Chattanooga, Tennessee whiskey actually uses a 3 and 4 char, and they age them for different lengths and then blend them together. So everybody's got their own story, their own combination. And the last is the percentage of alcohol. And most whiskeys are between 40%, usually 43%, and 65% alcohol by volume. Like Booker's is 65%. That 62.5%. That stuff that'll light you on fire. That stuff is hot. Okay. Whistle Pig is 50% alcohol by volume or 100 proof. And when ask me about proof when we get to rum, there's a story about why proof and rum. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so that's bourbon. So every bourbon, what makes Maker's Mark, Maker's Mark? What makes Wild Turkey, Old Granddad, Knob Creek, these whiskeys have a mash bill, length of aging, percentage of alcohol, and what's the last thing?
ABV.
Was that?
Char.
The char, the thickness of char. And so that's what makes each one of them different from each other. But there is this thing called a single barrel bourbon. A regular bourbon, they make tens of thousands of barrels. They put all 4 of those criteria into motion, and when it reaches the proper length of aging, they take all of those barrels and they blend them all together and they make a very consistent, very delicious bourbon called Maker's Mark. And that's their story. And Elijah Craig, and that's their story. But occasionally, they'll have these thousands of barrels, and the master distiller will go through and he'll taste each barrel individually and say, no, that's not ready. No, that's not ready. Oh, I want to use that to blend over here. I want to use that to blend over there. That's not ready. Oh, this one. Dump all the liquid from this keg right now. You get about 270 bottles out of a keg. All of a liquid in a single barrel bourbon came from one barrel that the master distiller was like, this is so yummy, because different barrels are different. Maybe the oak of that particular tree was sweet, or the terroir affected the flavor, or maybe it was stored low down in the warehouse instead of high up where it's more humid. Heat rises, so it's more humid, more evaporation, more expansion and contraction. Maybe it's slowly down here, or they rotate it. There's so many X factors we can't control. Every barrel is slightly different. So a single barrel bourbon, unless you get a bottle from the same barrel, which is highly unusual, every bottle is unique, every bottle is different, but it was all selected by the master distiller. It's the good stuff, and whiskey connoisseurs appreciate the slight variations and striations from bottle to bottle. Who can name me an example of a single barrel bourbon? Blanton's. I mean, Booker's, Blanton's, Baker's, Basil Hayden, all of those make a single barrel. Four Roses makes a single barrel. Old Forester makes a single barrel. Speaking of Blanton's, you guys are familiar with the Blanton's? You know the story behind Blanton's? He knows.
I know you can collect the tops.
Yes. So here's the deal. The owner of Blanton's used to race horses in the Kentucky Derby. And in fact, there are 8 different figurines on top. It's a horse and a jockey in a different position of stride. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner by the horse's foot, there's a circle there, and inside that circle is a letter. And each different figurine of all the 8 figurines spells out Blantons. There's two N's, and one of the N's has a period to differentiate it from the other N. And if you collect all 8, the distillery, and you take a photo and send it to the distillery, they'll send you a barrel staff, and you can set up all 8 and make a display and put it on your mantle or whatever you want to do. It kind of looks like a Pokemon ball, so I say this is like Pokemon for adults, because you got to collect them all. Got to have them all. Okay, and that's what they all look like. The 8 different tops. But that is a single barrel bourbon, and if we look at the label there, there's so much information on it. It says, this bourbon whiskey was dumped on March 12th, 2009 from barrel number 193, stored in warehouse number 34 on rickshaw number 56, was individually selected, filtered, and bottled by hand at 93 proof or 46% ABV, alcohol by volume. How much information is that? And by the way, if you ever had Stranahan's whiskey from Colorado, they do one. They get so granular, they're like going, this was distilled on March 6th at 2:56 in the afternoon, and Jimi Hendrix was playing. They tell you what musical artist was playing when they dumped the whiskey. I mean, it's kind of nerdy, but that's how granular you can get. So that's a single barrel bourbon. Now you know bourbon. Okay? Congratulations, you guys are bourbon experts. So there's other type of whiskey in the United States called rye whiskey. A rye whiskey is very simple. It must have at least 51% or more rye in the mash bill. That's it. That's the only thing you really need to know. Tom Bullitt rye, the green label Bullitt rye, that one's 95% rye, 5% malted barley. Boom. The Rittenhouse rye is 100% rye. But some of them are 60% rye or whatever. It has to have at least 51% rye, and that's a rye. Okay, that was easy enough. What's next? Tennessee whiskey. How is Tennessee whiskey different from bourbon? The Lincoln County process. That is correct. First and foremost, Tennessee whiskey must be made in the state of Tennessee. It cannot be made outside of Tennessee and called Tennessee whiskey. So that's one thing. And of course, they're very proud of their limestone filtration. Same with bourbon. It's the same limestone in that part of the country. That's why the best bourbons are made in Kentucky and in Tennessee. It's because of that limestone filtration. It makes a huge difference. The water makes a huge difference. So just because it's not made there doesn't mean it's bad, but some of the best whiskeys, some of the best bourbons are surely made in Kentucky and Tennessee. The Lincoln County process. So do you know what the Lincoln County process is?
Generally, yeah.
You want to give it a stab and try to explain it?
So it's mostly to do with filtration, how they filtrate it. It's like a charcoal filtration that Jack Daniels does. So it doesn't really classify it any differently as bourbon.
Right.
I'm not sure what the mash bill is for Jack Daniels, but it's around the same as most bourbons, but it's a higher corn mash bill. So
that's right.
People also classify it as not a corn whiskey because that's over 80. Around 80 proof.
Right. Remember, bourbons are maxed out at 80%, right? Yeah. Jack Daniel's 89% corn.
And so that's pretty much it. It's around. There's a lot of debate that Tennessee whiskey is technically bourbon, but they just want to be different and classify it as Tennessee whiskey.
Yeah.
Most distilleries do filtration with charcoal.
Yeah. So I'll give you. That was an A- description. That was a solid description. But just to be a little bit more granular, just to put you over the top on the A+, what you got here is Tennessee whiskey. It must be made in Tennessee, and the Lincoln County process is called double charcoal mellowing. Double charcoal mellowing. All bourbons are single charcoal mellowed because we toast or char the inside of the barrel, and as it ages, it comes from this white corn whiskey. Remember, it comes off the still clear, and it transforms into this beautiful golden dark brown whiskey. And so that is the single charcoal mellowing. But what Lincoln County process does, they do something different. They take a bunch of wooden pallets, shipping pallets, wooden pallets, they bust them up and they make a huge pile of wood. Like they take a bulldozer and make this huge pile of wood, and they soak it in whiskey. And they light it up. And while it's burning, this huge bonfire, they start to hose it down with water because they don't want it to get so hot that it burns down into white ash. They want it to burn down into black charcoal. And now that black charcoal is seasoned with the whiskey. It's flavored with the whiskey. And after they make their white corn distillate, they filter it through this seasoned flavored charcoal, which removes impurities, but also imparts flavor onto the spirit. And then they put it into a thick char barrel. In the case of Jack Daniels, a 4-char thick barrel, 89% corn in the mash bill, aged for 3 years for Jack Daniels number 7. And now we have this beautiful, beautiful whiskey called Jack Daniels. Frank Sinatra's favorite whiskey. He had it in his contract every time he sang, and he stepped off stage. Waiting for him were 2 fingers of Jack Daniels and 3 ice cubes. He had a bottle buried in his coffin with him. And in very recent years, last couple of years, there's a new whiskey, a Tennessee whiskey. It's an up-and-comer, which is just replacing Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels is the most recognized #1 whiskey in the world. This stuff is sick. And if you haven't had it, you should try it. It's called Uncle Nearest. Have anybody tried that? So Uncle Nearest is kind of the newest, baddest thing. And here's what happened. There was a black American woman who had her PhD, and she went back in history and found out that Jack Daniels owned slaves. And in particular, he owned a slave whose name was Uncle Nearest. And Uncle Nearest taught Jack Daniels how to make whiskey. He's the one who used a sour mash, kind of like making bread. He took a little bit from the batch before, which had the yeast in it, and put it into the next batch. So it's always the mother yeast from pot to pot. It's a sour mash, going from one distillation to the next distillation. Anyway, she found Uncle Nearest's original recipe pre-Jack Daniels and another recipe that he did post-Jack Daniels. That's the 1856 and the 1864, which is after the Civil War. And they made both recipes. And is winning all kinds of gold medals, all kinds of awards. It is crazy good Tennessee whiskey. It's also twice as expensive as Jack Daniels, but it's worth every penny of it. And it's called Uncle Nearest. You got to try it out. Delicious stuff. All right, what else? That's Tennessee whiskey. Congratulations, guys. You are now American whiskey experts. The only other thing is a new category that's rising in America called single malts. It's 100% malted barley like Scotch is, but we're doing it with American style, American terroir, American land. You know, it's not Scotch. It's a new emerging category. There's about 135 American distilleries doing American single malt, which is 100% malted barley. You don't have to worry about that. We're done with America. Okay, moving on to Canadian whiskey. Everything's going to go much faster from now on. Yeah. What's the difference between Canadian whiskey and American whiskey? Say what?
Made in Canada.
Made in Canada. Yes, that is true. But prior to Prohibition, there really was no discernible difference between American whiskey and Canadian whiskey. There really wasn't any, there wasn't any rules or government oversight or regulations, so there wasn't any discernible difference between American whiskey and Canadian whiskey. But a couple things happened during Prohibition. In 1916, World War I broke out, the Great War, the First War. And in 1918, women in Canada earned the right to vote. Sound similar? Sound familiar? And the Women's Christian Temperance Society of Canada said, politicians like, ladies, what do you want? And they said, we want to make it illegal to drink alcohol. This is all 2 years before America had their prohibition. And so Canada had a prohibition, but they didn't want to stop making alcohol. They said, the ladies said, look, all that rye that you're using for whiskey could be used to feed the troops. And the politicians were like, because what kind of jerk doesn't want to feed the troops? Like, okay. So they passed the prohibition in 1918, and that same year, the war ended in 1918. And all the politicians were like, if we just held out. So it took them 2 full years to repeal the prohibition. Canada repealed their prohibition in 1920. What happened in 1920? America started their prohibition. The difference between American prohibition and Canadian prohibition, A, it was only 2 years for Canada, and B, they were still distilling rye whiskey during the war and then selling it for export to make money for the war. Now they have all the storehouses full of whiskey, and America goes into a prohibition. So what happens? What do? Like Al Capone, all those guys start buying all cases and cases of Canadian whiskey and bootlegging it across into New York, into Buffalo, into Chicago, and bringing in all of this Canadian whiskey and distributing it out through the United States. Canadian whiskey was king. The problem is Canada was like, oh crud. The demand for Canadian whiskey went through the roof because now it's illegal to get alcohol in the United States. Where are you going to go? Canada. So, problem is Canada looked and said, was forecasting, what's the most expensive part about making a good whiskey? Time. Takes a minimum of 2 years to make a whiskey. So the Canadians are like, what do we do? How do we stretch out our stash? Right? It's like the cocaine dealer, and how do we do it? We cut our whiskey. So the Canadians started cutting their whiskey with unaged, neutral grain rye. 100% rye, unaged. What's another name for unaged rye? Vodka. Rye vodka. So they would take their their mash bill would have some percentage of corn to wheat to barley to rye. Everybody had their own mash bill. And then after they aged it for a minimum of 2 years, they would add rye vodka to it and then add some caramel or some sugar to make it sweeter. And now I was getting my buzz on. I wasn't getting ripped off. I was getting the same amount of alcohol, but making rye vodka, I can make that all day long. That's easy. No aging. So they were taking their great aged whiskeys, blending in rye vodka, and then adding sugar to make it sweet. And 13 years later, when Prohibition ended, Americans had acquired a taste for this lighter, softer, sweeter, more muted style of whiskey, which we now call Canadian whiskey. What are the big Canadian whiskeys out there? Okay, so Crown Royal for sure. That actually came on in the 50s and 60s after Prohibition, but they are king. Everyone knows that Crown Royal. What else do you say?
Seagram's.
There's Canadian Club, and there's Seagram's VO, right? Seagram's is one of those Canadian families that have made a killing during Prohibition. Canadian family. They made so much money that when Prohibition was over and Americans had acquired a taste for this Canadian style of whiskey, they came down into the United States, into Western Pennsylvania, and they built a new distillery, and they started making an American style whiskey in the Canadian style. An American whiskey done in the Canadian style. And that name of that whiskey is Seagram's 7. Seagram's 7 is an American whiskey done in the Canadian style. And when I was growing up, before I was this guy and learned about all my spirits, when I was a bartender in the 90s, somebody asked me for a Manhattan, you automatically reached for Crown Royal because you knew it had a higher rye content. We didn't know why it had a higher rye content. We just knew that it had a higher rye content, and a proper Manhattan is supposed to be made with rye whiskey. Now I know. I go, oh, that makes sense. Congratulations, guys. You are now Canadian and American whiskey experts. There's the distilleries in Canada and all the different Canadian whiskeys and blah, blah, blah. All right, Irish whiskey. We're not going to get into Irish whiskey too much. I just say this. Irish whiskey had the jump on Scotland, as I said earlier. All throughout Scotland and Ireland, there's this little flower that grows and dies called heather. And as the heather grows and dies and grows and dies, it starts to decompose. What happens to the trees and the leaves if all mankind died tomorrow? We just all died. Every year the trees would grow leaves, every year they would drop the leaves, and every year it would grow new leaves and drop leaves. What would happen to those leaves over time? And not in the case of leaves. That's in the case of heather. So yes, you guys are right. You're dancing around the right thing. But what happens is it decomposes, And eventually that decaying vegetable matter over a long period of time eventually becomes charcoal. That's what charcoal is decomposed vegetable matter, which is why in West Virginia and Appalachia, they have thick with trees and dropping leaves every year and year after year. It just builds up, and that's why those deposits of coal are everywhere. That's why there's so much coal. Now, in Scotland and Ireland, it's the same thing, but this little purple flower called heather has a very distinct flavor, very distinct character to it. And that layer halfway between rotting, decomposed vegetable matter and charcoal, there's a thin layer in between, and that is called peat. Peat. It's a fuel. You can burn it like charcoal. But the thing is, in Ireland and Scotland, they tend to use a lot more barley. Whereas in America, we're using a lot of corn, and we supplement it with a little wheat or barley or rye. In Scotland and Ireland, they use a lot of barley, and they dry out this fresh barley and unlock all of the starches. They germinate it, or they dry it out, and by drying it out, it unlocks the starches to become fermentable sugars, which we can now put in a pot still with water and yeast, and it gobbles up the sugar and turns it into whiskey, which we then distill and age, and eventually becomes whiskey. In the case of Ireland, they always use Irish whiskey is always triple distilled. That's 3 times distilled, and always in a copper pot, alembic still. And one of the ways that they dry out that fresh barley is to take some peat, light it on fire, and as the smoke rises up, it dries out the barley and unlocks the fermentable sugars. It also imparts this smoky flavor, which is why peated or smoky scotches and or Irish whiskeys taste so very different than American whiskeys. It's got that little bit of smoke or peat onto it. Okay? Now, there are many different styles. You can 100% malted barley. Most Irish whiskeys are predominantly corn with wheat and rye, and they blend in some malted barley, some of that smoked malted barley. That's Jameson's, that's Bushmills. And I only say this, 2 things destroyed the Irish whiskey business. The first thing that destroyed it was back in the 1800s, there was over 2,000 distilleries all around Ireland, and the Irish government couldn't keep track of all these little mom and pop shops. Everybody was making Irish whiskey, and they couldn't track every single drop being made and tax it. So they said, you know what, we're just going to do a flat tax. If you're making whiskey, you pay your flat tax, you can make as much Irish whiskey and go to town. And they'll say, let's say the flat tax is $100,000. Well, back in the mid-1800s, Jameson's and Bushmills and Middleton, they were like, oh, $100,000, you know what? Here, take $200,000, buy the kids something special, no problem. But all the small guys are like, $100,000 might have been $10 million. Like, I make 20 cases a year to drink for my local village, and I make a little extra money on the side. $100,000 is ridiculous. I don't even make, I'm not even selling $100,000 worth of revenue. That's ridiculous. And Ireland went from 2,000 distilleries. In 50 years, they went from 2,000 distilleries down to 50 distilleries, and then down to 4 distilleries. And those 4 distilleries were making 10, 12, 15, 20 labels of Irish whiskey as they started to consolidate their resources. Because, Patty and Joe and Mikey were like, hey, listen, I'm over here, you're over there, I can't pay the taxes, you can't, why don't we all distill at my place? I'll distill at the day, you distill at night, we'll split the taxes. And then, hey, you know what, you get in here too, and now we got 3 distillers, now we got 6 distillers, now we got 10 distillers. Hey, let's add an extra pot still. Let's grow the size of the place. And they're all, he's like, hey, wait, how are you getting your rye for so cheap? Well, I went in with Mikey and Patty, and we got it down to 25 cents a bushel. Hey, if I get in on that, can we bring it down to 23 cents? Absolutely. And so they started sourcing their rye and their corn from the same sources. And they're getting their water from the same source. And they lost their sense of authenticity, their sense of heritage, their sense of terroir. And so Irish whiskey went boom. The other thing that killed the Irish whiskey business is after World War I, Europe was broke. Great Britain was broke, and they needed to pay for the war. And they said, what are we going to do? We need to raise taxes. Who can we tax? Let's tax the Irish. That's typical. Well, what do the Irish have to tax? Whiskey. So they taxed the living a lot of Irish whiskey. Well, the Irish were like, we're not going to put up with that. You know what? We're going to sell to the Americans. The Americans love our Irish whiskey. There's lots of Irish immigrants. We're cutting Europe off. We're not going to sell to you. Ha ha! Hey, Americans, go ahead and buy our Irish whiskey. And America said, yeah, about that. We're going to stop drinking for the next 13 years. Prohibition. Killed the Irish whiskey business. They were shipping some Irish whiskey over, to be sure. There was lots of bootlegging of Irish whiskey as well, but not nearly to the extent of Canadian or other whiskeys. And the point is that those big four survived, Jameson's being king, and there was really the only game in town for the longest time. Today, right now, we're seeing a massive resurgence of Irish whiskey. Knobloch Castle, Green Spot, Yellow Spot, Redbreast. These are all phenomenal Irish whiskeys. They're all coming back with a vengeance. J.J. Corey's is a friend of mine who's making her own Irish whiskey from scratch. Killer Irish whiskey. I'm telling you, Irish whiskey isn't as pricey or expensive as single malt Scotch is, but it's gonna get there soon. Buy now. Irish whiskey is the bomb. Jameson's is okay, but there's some cool stuff out there. So just FYI. Now, Scotland. Now Scotland, there's 3 different types of Scotch whiskey that you need to know about. There's blended Scotches, vatted malts, sometimes called a Scotch blend, which is kind of confusing, and single malt Scotches. So I'm going to describe these right now. A single malt Scotch is a whiskey made in Scotland. Rule number 1, it has to be made in Scotland. Rule number 2 is it has to be made from 100% malted barley. 100% malted barley. And rule 3 is that it must be made in a single distillery. It sounds weird. It's like, what? That's a rule? It's an important rule, and I'll explain why in a second. So 3 rules of single malt Scotch. 100% malted barley, no corn, no wheat, no rye. 100% malted barley, must be made in a single distillery, and must be made in Scotland. Is that right to say? Yeah. Okay. Now, a blended Scotch is predominantly corn or wheat or rye with some malted barley blended in. Give me an example of a single malt Scotch. Give me a name. Glenlivet. Okay, it's all right. Listen, we're here to learn.
Glenmorangie.
Glenmorangie. Okay, I'm going to throw out some names and see if you've heard of any of them. Macallan, Highland Park, Talisker, Oban, Laphroaig, Lagavulin, Ardbeg, Glenkinchie, Auchentoshan, Balvenie, and Glenfiddich, Glenmorangie. Yeah, there's a million of them out there. Here, let me just show you. There is a map of all of the single malt distilleries, the only single malts, all throughout Scotland. But this area is so prolific at making great Scotch. Up there in the middle of the map, there's a white box, and that area is called Speyside. And that area is so prolific at making great Scotch whiskies that it has its own map. I'm going to zoom in on just that white box, and now we see names that we recognize. We see Glenfarclas, Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, we see Macallan, and many others. Most of them you haven't heard of, but some of them you have, and those are all single malt Scotch whiskeys from Speyside. We back to the big map. The names that you should know there in the lowlands is Glenkinchie and Auchentoshan. And then you get up into the highlands. Way in the northern highlands, you see Glenmorangie and Dalmore. And then we see in Orkney Island, Highland Park, over to island of Skye, we see Talisker. And then we go all the way down to the lower left-hand corner, and there's another map. And that's the island of Islay, I-S-L-A-Y. And it's a whole nother map. And we see names, and other names we recognize. Bowmore, Lagavulin, Ardbeg, Brutladich, Carol Isla, Port Ellen, Laphroaig, and Bruna Habanahan. I can't even say it. The point is that these are very oily, very smoky, very peaty, very aggressive Scotches. When you're making an intelligent Scotch recommendation, If somebody says, I like Macallan, and you say, I don't have Macallan, but I have Lefroy, they're going to look at you cockeyed like you're some kind of weirdo. It's like saying, hey, I really like Velveeta. And you go, oh, can I recommend some smoked Gouda? And you're like going, what? That it tastes nothing like Velveeta. But Velveeta's not even cheese, is it? Craft singles, I don't know. The point is, Speyside scotches are very balanced, almost always copper pot distilled, twice copper pot distilled. They have to be pot distilled, by the way. All Scotch whiskey. And the lowlands, they do triple distillation, and that's Glencairn and Auchentoshan. But the rest, they all use copper pot stills, twice distilled. In the case of Speyside, very full flavored, very sweet, very caramelized, very balanced. And the Northern Highlands is a little bit sweeter. It's like a caramel cube, over sweet, but Americans like that style. And then in the Highlands, Highland Park is the #1 selling single malt Scotch. They have the ocean spray comes off and a salt crust on the barrels. So it's almost like a caramel cube dipped in salt. Yum, delicious. Then you come around to Talisker on Skye, on the Isle of Skye. That has a little bit more peat, a little bit more smoke to it. So it's like a slightly salted caramel cube dipped in salt. Yum, yum. And then you come all the way down to Islay, and now you get these big, oily, smoky scotches. They smell like iodine and fresh bandages. All right, what I want you all to do, smell the Macallan first and smell the Lefroy different second. An Islay Scotch is oily and peaty. It's like taking that caramel cube, dipping it in salt, and then rubbing it in a cigar ashtray. It is oily, it is smoky, it is a whole different monster. So smell the one, pass it down, no drinking. So guys, here's the point. We're going to get you these maps, but here's the thing. You don't have to memorize every single distillery. You just need to know all of your scotches and what part of the map they're from. And that way, if somebody asks you for a recommendation, especially if they know, and they say Macallan, and you say, you know, if you like Macallan, have you tried Glenlivet? Or have you tried Glenfiddich? Because those are, even though they're different scotches, they're from the same geography and they have a similar style. They tend to have similar flavor profiles. Not always the case, but that is a good rule of thumb. All right, that's it for Scotland. In recent years, ever since 1890s, especially 1923, Japan started making Scotch-style whiskeys. And they were very good at it, and Japanese are very meticulous and they do things the right way. But in recent years, really in the last 30 or 40 years, they actually contracted with Macallan. They went over and studied how to make great Scotch, and they brought the master distiller from Macallan to Japan to teach them how to make great single malt Scotches. And they started making a blended Scotch style and a Scotch style. I didn't tell you there's the blended Scotches. Sorry, I'll get to that in a second. The point was, the Japanese got in the game, and they're winning all kinds of awards. And they make the Hibiki and the Suntory, Suntory, Hibiki, and Yamazaki, which is the single malt Scotch style and the blended Scotch style. And just the point is that Japan's now firmly on the map because they're winning all kinds of the best whiskeys in the world. They sold out of everything, and now they have to age. They're in this desperate period while they're waiting to everything to age so they can get back in the game because it's all sold out because they started winning all these awards. Blended Scotch, quickly. What's a blended Scotch? It's mostly corn with wheat and barley blended in and some malted barley in there. Give me some examples of a blended Scotch. The #1 blended Scotch in America. Oh, maybe now is actually #2, but actually #1 is Dewar's. Johnny Walker Red Label, aged for 6 years. Black Label, aged for 12 years. Gold Label, 18 years. Blue Label, unspecified number of years, as he's taking some of the best of the youngest, some of the best of the oldest, and blending them together, making a master blend, and they charge accordingly. It's really expensive, but it's really good blended Scotch whiskey. There's also some last category called a Scotch blend or a vatted malt, and that's different from a blended Scotch, and that's like Johnny Walker Green Label for age 15 years, and the famous Grouse. A blended Scotch or Scotch blend. A Scotch blend or vatted malt is when they take a whole bunch of single malt Scotches from a bunch of different distilleries and blend them together. So Johnny Walker Green Label, they take some Macallan, some Ardbeg, some Highland Park, some Talisker, and they blend them all together and they make a completely original single malt from a bunch of different distilleries, and we call that a vatted malt. Some other blended scotches. Remember, blended scotches with corn and everything else with a little malted barley blended in. Dewar's, Johnny Walker, Chivas Regal, Cutty Sark, J&B. You've heard these names before? Okay, these are all blended Scotch whiskeys. You guys are learning more. You now know more about whiskey than 99% of bartenders out there who are selling whiskey, even if it didn't all stick. Even if they only retained 20% of what I told you, you still know more than 99%. Because most bartenders couldn't tell you the difference between a bourbon and a Tennessee whiskey, much less a Canadian whiskey, to save their life. So now you know, and I hope that this kind of sparks a match with some of you. Start picking up your labels and start looking at the bottles and start learning about these things, because now you have a vocabulary. You know what's the difference between a column and a pot still. You know about the raw materials and how that influences the spirit, about the percentage of alcohol, the country of origin, on all these kinds of things. So it really makes a difference, and I just want to, and tomorrow we'll get into more tasty stuff. Tomorrow's more yummy. So, tequila. All right, so show of hands, don't lie. Who here has ever had a bad experience with tequila? All right, there's some more hands coming up, I can see. Okay. So here's the thing. Tequila is one of these terribly misunderstood and horribly misrepresented spirits. It is sugar that gives you a wicked headache. If you have a sugar headache, the alcohol dehydrates you. So if you're dehydrated with a sugar headache, that's called a hangover, and it sucks. It hurts. So obviously drink responsibly. But if you go out with your buddies and you're like pounding a couple beers, then you hook up with your girlfriends and their friends, and they're like, oh, we want some red wine. So you get a glass of red wine with your pinky out, because that's what you do. And now you go out clubbing and you go to the nightclub and he's like, hey, Jaeger bombs, yeah, Jaeger, da 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 da. Now it's the end of the night and it's like, I love you guys. 17 shots, tequila! And you get some salt and some lime and a little, it's the last thing in, and the next morning, it's the first thing out, right? And the thing is, tequila's got a lot of flavor. And it doesn't get you any more or less drunk than vodka. It's 40% alcohol by volume. It gets you less drunk than gin, same amount by volume, less drunk than whiskey, same amount by volume. So tequila is just terribly misunderstood. And the fact is, if you have a really good tequila and you sip on that all night long, obviously you can't go to excess. But I'll give you an example. I used to work for Don Julio. And I had a chance to meet Don Julio before he passed away. And I was the global ambassador. And when I found out they were looking for an ambassador, I went to them. They didn't come to me. Obviously, you can see I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to spirits. I was going, hello, Don Julio? Yeah. Get to meet the man, the myth, the legend. And I was a gringo working for Mexico. And I was traveling around the world and educating on tequila and mixology and all this kind of stuff. Great job. And I'll tell you something. The first day I got that job, I went down to Mexico and I sat down and I went through the distillery and we got super granular, super geeky, learning all about tequila and blowing myself up. And then I said to the guy, and we went out for dinner and we got a bottle of Don Julio Reposado in the square bottle. And the master distiller and I got into serious conversation. He was a Dallas Cowboy fan and I was a Washington Commanders fan, which was not the Commanders back then. And we were like loggerheads. And before we knew it, we killed a whole bottle of tequila. A whole bottle. And I was like, oh man, I'm gonna get so fired. I just got this job. Oh, what did I do? I get back to my hotel, I was going, and I'm in the highlands of Jalisco and Atotonilco region. So now the higher altitude, the alcohol really affects you. It's much more pronounced when you're at higher altitude. So like, oh my God, I'm gonna be so sick tomorrow. So I took 2 giant pints of water, went glug, 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 and I laid down in the bed and stayed up late, so I had to get up at like 6 in the morning. I was like, oh my God, I got like 7 hours of sleep, or 6 hours, sorry, like 5 hours of sleep or something like that. Like I set my alarm clock, it went off the next morning. I reached over and hit it, and I opened my eyes. And you ever wake up in the morning and you just know you got a wicked headache, so you're like going, you don't move. You're like, so I went like this, like that. Like, what's going on? No headache. No headache. And I was like, what is happening? Don't get me wrong, I was butt-ass tired. I was so tired. It was a different kind of hangover because I was just like, but I did not have a wicked hangover. And it's because higher quality tequilas don't add any caramels or any sugars back to the spirit. Cheaper ones do. And we're going to talk about the differences between them and how you can tell the difference and why you should always drink the good stuff. With tequila, you kind of get what you pay for. And you should always spring for a couple extra dollars and get the better stuff. And I'll tell you how to tell the difference between the two. So, tequila, what's it made from? Blue agave. What is blue agave? I was waiting for somebody to say that. It's actually not a cactus, but it certainly looks like one. It's green and it's thorny and it's spiky. Fair enough. Agave is really a distant cousin to aloe vera. It's a succulent. And when we grow these agaves to full length, the farmer who cultivates them is called the jimador. And the jimador takes this round tool called a koa, a very sharp round tool, and he sharpens it. He has a little sharpening blade, and he shaves off the pencas or the leaves of the agave plant. And at the base is this big ball of starch called the piña, which is a Spanish word for pineapple, because it kind of looks like a pineapple. You know, if you like piña coladas, right? So here, that's the you guys, that's before your time. Oh man. So that's the piña, which is the heart of the agave plant. Tequila can only be made in Mexico, just like bourbon can only be made in the United States of America, and cognac and Armagnac and Champagne can only be made in those regions in France. It has it's internationally protected. And in fact, there are 50, I don't know how many states there are in Mexico, but there are 5 states in particular that can make tequila: Jalisco, Guanajuato, Michoacán, Nayarit, and Tamaulipas. The only one you have to know, and you should all know it, is Jalisco. Jalisco produces 97% of all tequila in the world. Nowhere outside of those 5 states can you grow agave, distill it, and make a spirit called tequila. Yes, it's made with a specific species of agave called Weber Blue, blue agave. And that's the only species allowed in tequila. Whereas mezcal and raicilla and sotol and bacanora, other agave distillates from Mexico, you can use any number of species of agave. Some require you to use just espadín, others use just this. Mezcal can use any number of species of agave to blend in. We'll talk about mezcal in a minute, but tequila can only use Weber Blue. So, there are 2 major classifications of tequila. There is tequila, which today we're going to call tequila mixto. The Mexicans don't call it that, but we're going to call it tequila mixto and define that. And then we have another classification called tequila 100% agave. A tequila mixto is at least, by law, 51% blue agave, and the remainder is usually either corn or sugarcane. In other words, cheap white whiskey or cheap white rum. And they blend it in there with the agave, and they make this less expensive tequila. Then you have tequila 100% agave. And tequila 100% agave, you're not allowed to add anything to it. It's only 100% Weber Blue, period. Now, how can you as professionals tell the difference between the two? Read the label. If on the bottle, if somewhere on the bottle, it says the words 100% agave, and I really don't know why Don Julio hides it in such small letters, but if it doesn't say the words 100% agave or 100% puro agave, it's a mixto. Mixtos, they can add caramel, and they do. They can add sugar syrup, and they do. They can add glycerin, and they do. Depends on the style. So it is best to always buy a 100% agave tequila, and as long as it's certified by the CRT, which is the Consejo Regulatorio del Tequila, that's all the Spanish I know, but it sounds pretty good, right? The Consejo oversees, regulates, authenticates, and certifies all tequila to make sure it is meeting the rules governing tequila. So if it's 100% agave. So now we know tequila and tequila 100% agave. Now we have these classifications. Blanco and silver mean the same thing. A blanco or silver tequila is any tequila, whether it's a mixto or 100% agave, makes no difference. It's any tequila that's been aged in an oak barrel, almost always reclaimed American whiskey barrels, for between 0 days and 59 days. Between 0 days and 59 days. In the case of Don Julio, they age it for 0 days because they want you to taste what 100% authentic Highland agave tastes like, unadulterated by oak. In my professional opinion, the only reason to put aging on a Blanco tequila is to round out some of the rough edges on the impurities of the distillate. You're trying to give it a little extra sweetness, a little extra something, so that because it's not an excellent spirit. And I can give you some examples of tequilas that do that. Also, you have reposado or arrested tequila. A reposado or rested tequila is any tequila that's aged 60 days or more. 60 days or more. Now an añejo tequila or an aged tequila is any tequila that's aged in an oak barrel for 1 year or more. Now you say, well, Brian, why don't you just say a reposado is 60 days to 1 year and then an añejo is 1 year or more? Because if I take an 8-month-old tequila, that falls in the category of a reposado. And I take some 18-month-old tequila, that falls in the category of an añejo. And I blend them together, they default to the younger statement. They become a reposado. So it's not 60 days to 1 year, it's 60 days or more for a reposado. Make sense? Añejo is 1 year or more. Extra añejo is 3 years or more. Then they have this category called a cristalino añejo. It's an añejo tequila. Actually, cristalino can be extra añejo or anything. Cristalino is its own category. They take an aged tequila and they run it through a charcoal filter that has an electrical current running through it. So it's activated charcoal with an electrical current, and all of the coloring part of the aged brown tequila bonds to the charcoal, and it's filtered out. So it comes out clear, crystal clear. It's a cristalino, but it has all the flavor of an aged añejo tequila. Okay? And there's a relatively new category called rosa. And a rosa tequila is any tequila that's been aged, usually in a reclaimed red wine barrel. And it has kind of this brownish red rose color. This is a beautiful rose color. Okay? Now, other category is called a joven tequila. A joven tequila is called a young, that's the Spanish word for young, is a joven. These are almost always mixto tequilas. And a mixto tequila, in fact, they are mixto tequilas, so they can have 51% blue agave, and the rest is corn or sugarcane. But then if they add sugar or anything back to the distillate after distillation, then it becomes a joven. It goes from a mixto to a joven. They add caramel and stuff like that. Now, can you tell from the color whether it's a mixto or a blanco or reposado? Can you tell? Not necessarily. For example, Herradura Reposado is a reposado tequila aged for 11 months in a dark, they take a reclaimed Four Roses barrel and they rechar the inside of the barrel after it's been used for bourbon. So they rechar it so they get more color extraction. So an 11-month-old Reposado Herradura is very dark, whereas Don Julio 1942 they scrape out the inside of the barrel so that there's very little char, and they let it age for 24 to 36 months, 38 months. So technically that could be even an extra añejo, but because it defaults to the youngest, it's always considered an añejo tequila. Don Julio 1942 is much lighter in color than Herradura Reposado. So the color does not necessarily equate to age. That's one thing. The other thing is, can you tell from looking at it whether it's a mixto or a blanco? No, because there are clear mixtos and clear 100% agaves and clear mixtos. There are aged mixtos and aged 100% agaves. Cuervo Gold has the word gold on the label. It's a Joven because it has that gold color because they added caramel to give it the illusion that it's been aged in oak barrels. Cuervo Gold in Mexico, they call it Cuervo Especial instead of Cuervo Gold, and and it says Reposado because it's a true Reposado. It's a mixto. They're still adding some caramel to it, and it's 51% agave, but they're actually aging it for 60 days in a barrel. Whereas in America, it's just Blanco tequila with caramel added to it, lots of sugar. Cuervo Gold will give you a headache. It'll give you a sugar headache. So avoid the mixtos. Same with Sauza. So now the last thing I want to talk about is the geographies. There's two different geographies. There's the lowlands and the highlands. The lowlands is kind of from Guadalajara left, where Puerto Vallarta is, and you see up there the little town of Tequila. That's where tequila was first born. The lowlands is very earthy and rustic style. They say it has cojones. It's very earthy and has gravitas. That's things like Espolón, Cuervo, Sauza, Herradura. They're all lowland tequilas. The best tequilas are said to come from the highlands, and it's somewhat subjective, but there's a science behind it. In the highlands, it's a much higher altitude. You have bright red soil. It's rich with volcanic minerals and ash. The lowlands has a lot of ash and has a lot more rainfall. The highlands is a very bright red with copper and iron, and the piña has to fight to get water and nutrients. So there's a lot tighter residual sugars in the heart. So like grapes on a vine, less water means for more residual sugars. So it's very clean, very bright, naturally sweeter style of tequila. In the highlands you have like Patron, Don Julio, Siete Leguas, El Tesoro, which is one of my favorite tequilas, is phenomenal. El Tesoro is incredible. And so these are all highland tequilas, usually up in the northeast corner of that map, up in the San Juan region, near the Los Altos region, which includes Atotonilco and the others. Patron's okay. They are not great 100% agave tequila. They are great again. They started off being Siete Leguas. Siete Leguas made the tequila for Patron. Up until 10 years ago, it was illegal to sell Patron in the country of Mexico. It was against the law because Don Julio sued them because that square bottle they have, that was Don Julio's original bottle. Like they went to the glass manufacturing plant and bought the same bottle and put the Patron label on it. And Don Julio sued them and said, you can't use our bottle. And they won the lawsuit. And they said, you can't sell this. You can make it here. You have to make it in Mexico, but you can't sell it here. So Paul Mitchell and that group bought Patron and said, forget Mexico. They don't have any money. Let's market it to the Americans. And it was the first 100% agave tequila that was properly marketed to the United States of America. And Americans were like, I know Cuervo, I know Sauza, I get the headache, I hate tequila, but I love this Patron because it doesn't give me the headache. And so people got into Patron, and Patron, by American standards, is like a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, when they got enough money, they started making their own tequila, and the Mexican people, they could only get it in Mexican resort cities, or American resort cities like Cabo San Lucas or Puerto Vallarta or Cancun, where a lot of Americans, they would always have some Patron because people demanded it, and the Mexican government capitulated. But people would drink it, the Mexicans were drinking it and going, what's with the stupid Americans? It's okay tequila. It's not great tequila. It's 100% agave, but it was like a 6 or 7 on a scale of 1 to 10. Now they had so much money, they're making the Roca, and they've gone back and they've reformulated. Now they're making really good tequila again. I give Patron today an 8.5, maybe a 9. It's really very, very good again. Don Julio, if you go to Mexico, they'll tell you it's the gold standard. Don Julio did about 60 things that no one had ever done before, and he created one of the highest quality tequilas in the world. And he did it not to sell. He did it for a private party to celebrate 50 years of making tequila since he was 17 years old in the year 1942. Sound familiar? And he went ahead and made this incredible tequila as a gift for his friends and family. And they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. Where can we buy this? He goes, guys, it took me like a year and a half to make this stuff. You'll never, ever, ever see it again. This is just for this party, and it's too expensive. And they said, how much? And back then, in the 80s, 1980s, a bottle of tequila was always in a tall bottle, and it was always a bottle of even good tequila would probably run you $9, $10, $12 back then. And that was pricey for tequila. And he's like, I'd have to charge like $30, $35 just to make this tequila. And the guy's like going, let's do it. And somebody backed him, they gave him a bunch of money. He's going, okay. And he started making this tequila. Now today, there are so many good tequilas out there. All of them are based on the work of Don Julio. Even the older guys like Cuervo, which is 220 years old, Herradura, all these guys predate Don Julio by 100 years. But they're all making these great 100% agave tequilas based on his work. Some guys do this better. Some guys do this uniquely that nobody else does. Somebody does these 3 things really good. But nobody did the whole complete package like Don Julio did back in the day. Now, El Tesoro is one of my favorites because this guy is a French cognac producer, but he's making great tequila in the cognac style and aging in French oak. It's delicious. So there's so many good tequilas out there. Don Julio is one of my favorites, but it's not even my favorite anymore. But so good, so good. All right. Questions about tequila? There's another spirit in Mexico called mezcal. Mezcal is made from any number of species of agave. They usually use wood-burning charcoal briquettes to smoke the agaves. Mezcal is the one with the worm in it. You will never see a worm in a bottle of tequila. You've never seen a worm in a bottle of tequila because it's against the law. There's no such thing. Never has been, never will be. It is mezcal, also made from agave, and they use wood-burning charcoal briquettes. The word mezcal is close to mescaline, so people think it's made from the mescaline cactus, which is a psychotropic drug, but it's not. And they believe that the worm, which burrows into that cactus, they think that if you eat the worm, it has psychotropic properties. It does not. But it does flavor the mezcal, and this is a little red worm, and is actually very tasty. And the guy thought, so he put a bottle. Monte Alban was the first one. It's not Monte Alban's like a mixto. It's a really terrible mezcal, but they were advertised in Playboy magazine for 10 years in the 70s and 80s, and they were like, we're not tequila, we're mezcal. And all the Americans were like, hey man, have you tried that new tequila, the one with the worm in it? And they never really delineated themselves from tequila, so everyone thinks that tequila has a worm in it. Not so. They say most mezcal is made in the south of Mexico, predominantly in Oaxaca, but it can also be made in Durango, San Luis Potosi, and even some of these tequila producing regions like Chihuahua and Guanajuato and Michoacan and so on and so forth. The point is this, in Mexico and Oaxaca, they say that if you drink an entire bottle of mezcal in 1 hour, and then you eat the worm, one way or another, you will see God. I don't recommend you try it. That's a bad idea. You're just going to get poisoning and die. Let's see here. That's tequila and mezcal. Let's talk about rum. So what's the raw material used to make rum? Yeah, sugarcane. So here's what you need to know about rum. There are 2 major classifications of rum. There's rum industrial and rum agricole. Rum industrial, like industrial, and rum agricole, like agriculture. Okay? Now, we believe the first rum was probably created in Barbados sometime around the mid-17th century. We know that Christopher Columbus probably brought sugarcane over from the Canary Islands off the west coast of Africa, but we think that sugarcane originally originated in Indonesia. So when they were doing when Spain and Great Britain were doing all the trade into India, into Asia, we believe that somewhere along the way they picked up some sugar cane, and they would either make granulated sugar and take it by land through China to Europe, or they would sail around the southern horn of Africa and bring up sugar cane, and they would plant it all in the Canary Islands. And there was a huge trade, and we believe they started making rum in Barbados because what they were trying to do was make lots of granulated sugar to take back to Europe. Up until that point, people either had honey or they had beet sugar, and those were the predominant sugars. But granulated cane sugar was very yummy and delicious and great for confections, and it was a new thing. So for every 1 liter of granulated sugar that they sent back to Europe, they had 2 liters of industrial waste, garbage. Today we would call that molasses. So for every liter of granulated sugar, they burned 2 sugars of molasses, which they just dumped in the ocean. They dumped millions of decaliters of molasses into the ocean because it was just garbage. And somebody said, hey, this stuff's got some sugar in it. We can ferment it, we can distill it, and now we've got yo-ho-ho, a bottle of rum. And they started making rum. Now, we'll talk about pirates in a second, but bottom line was, between Spain and Great Britain, they had the slave trade. So they would go down to Africa, they would pick up human beings, put them on slave ships, ferry them across to the to the Caribbean, pick up barrels of molasses, and either sell them there or head up the east coast of the United States, sell human beings, and then go up to Providence, Rhode Island. Providence, Rhode Island was at one point the rum capital of the world. It had over 31 rum distilleries. And they would drop off their barrels of molasses, which would all be distilled, and they would take those barrels of rum and bring them back to Europe along with the granulated sugar. So they were taking rum and sugar back to Europe, coming down, picking up human beings, taking them to the Caribbean to pick up barrels of molasses and sell human beings all up and down the east coast of the United States, go up to Providence and pick up, and that was the trade, back and forth, around and around. And they were all making different styles of rum. And when you talk about the pirates, if you belong to a government, you're kind of all on your own. You're kind of like rogue privateers. If you belong to a specific government, you are a privateer. If you belong to an alternate government or you're on your own, you are a pirate. But either way, all of those governments, the French, the Spanish, the English, and the Dutch, colonized, conquered, recolonized, and reconquered every one of those Caribbean islands. And whoever ended up with the island, usually their style of rum is the predominant style in that. So this is how you can tell whether it's rum or rum agricole. Rum industrial is made from sugarcane molasses. Rum agricole is made from sugarcane juice, fresh sugarcane juice. Let me go through the styles, then I'll tell you about how you can tell what kind of rum it is based on its country of origin. So, light style rum is either sugarcane molasses or sugarcane juice, industrial or agricole. You ferment it, you distill it, it comes off the still clear, that's light rum. Easy. Dark rum. We distill a light rum, and after distillation, we blend in some molasses after distillation, and now it's dark. Give me an example of a light rum. Bacardi Light. Can you give me an example of a dark rum?
Captain Morgan.
That's a spiced. Anybody know dark rum?
Plantation.
Plantation.
They have a 5-year. I think that's would that be?
No, that's an aged rum.
That's 8. I'm sorry.
Okay, so a dark rum would be something like Myers from Jamaica, or Gosling's Black Seal rum. Have you ever seen Gosling's Black Seal? That's what you make a dark and stormy with. You know how it got its name Black Seal? There's a seal on the front of the label balancing a barrel of rum on its nose. But back in the day, there was a big problem with counterfeiting. People would counterfeit good rum, especially during Prohibition, but even before that, hundreds of years before that, people would take old bottles and make cheap counterfeit rum or garbage with methanol in it, and they would sell it to people. But the better producers, like Black Seal, Goslings rather, would make a really good rum. They would add some molasses back to it, make a really good dark rum, and then they would put a cork in the bottle and drip it with black wax. And they would create a wax seal around the bottle so that, and you knew if it had a black wax on it, that was the Black Seal rum, and that was the good stuff. Also, another fun story. There was a guy during Prohibition named Roy McCoy, and Roy McCoy lived in Bermuda, and he would take cases and cases of white rum, of really good rum, and he would travel up the east coast of the United States in a ship, always 3 miles offshore. Roy McCoy never once broke the law during Prohibition. He would just park his ship offshore, and late at night, people would take these what are called rum runners. They just take a little wooden boat, and they take a car engine, probably from a Ford Model V or a Cadillac or something, whatever they got hold of. They put it in the back of this wooden boat, and they go, vroom, a little speedboat. They take off the lights, and they zoom out to the ship. And the ship would have a little light there, so they could see where it was. They pull up to the ship, load up with cases and cases of rum, pay McCoy cash, and then zoom back in. And on the shore, somebody would be holding a lantern like this, but with blinders so that nobody on the shore could see. But just out into the ocean, it'd be like do. They come running into that point, blind because they have no lights on. Unload all the rum, load it onto a car, and zip it into town and sell it for money. But, and I know you guys, I'm sorry to bring it back to the drug analogy, but this is all illegal, right? So if you're a cocaine dealer, and I know nobody here is, but let's just hypothetically, you're selling cocaine and you're doing a drug transaction. We've all seen, a CSI or a Law and Order, and a drug deal's going down, and you're going to buy they've got a whole suitcase full of packets of cocaine, and you've got a suitcase full of cash. What's the first thing you do before you hand the guy your cash?
Check it.
You check it, right? How do you check it?
Try it.
You pick out a random packet and you taste it or whatever. I don't know. Now you taste it and you make sure that it's the real stuff. Well, what happened back then was you get a whole bunch of cases of rum, and they go in there to grab a random box, pull out a random bottle, crack the top, take a swig, and they go, now that's the real McCoy. And that's how that phrase came to be. If you've ever heard that phrase, the real McCoy, that means it's authentic, it's the real stuff, it's the real deal. That's where that phrase came from. Okay? Now, getting back to our styles, light rum is that dark rum, whether it's rum agricole or from molasses rum industrial, we distill it to a light rum and then we add molasses, it becomes a dark rum. Spiced rum, we take a white rum, and then after we've distilled it, we add some sort of sugar, usually caramel or some sort of other sugar, and we infuse it with baking spices like cinnamon or clove or nutmeg or mace or whatever. And we let that infuse, and then we have a spiced rum. Of course, the most famous spiced rum is the Captain Morgan. But there's also Sailor Jerry's, and there's a relatively newcomer called the Kraken. And the Kraken uses Demerara sugar and adds it back. So it's kind of like a dark rum, but then they infuse it with spices, so now it's a spiced dark rum. Okay? And then we have aged rum, and that's easy. Whether it's rum agricole or rum industrial, we make a light rum and we put it into a barrel, almost always a reclaimed American whiskey barrel, and we let it age. And it becomes dark rum. Now, as a crude rule, and there are always exceptions, if the island of origin is of Spanish descent, aka Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, they tend to use column distillation, and they tend to distill from sugarcane molasses, rum industrial. There are some pot distilled rums from Jamaica which are phenomenal, and so on and so forth. But as a general rule, the Spanish-speaking countries, and that's true with Diplomatico in Venezuela, it's true with Zacapa in Guatemala. If it's a Spanish-speaking country, they tend to use column distillation with sugarcane molasses. If it's French, the French, like Martinique or Barbados or Haiti or Trinidad, these islands, they use copper pot alembic stills, and they make it from sugarcane juice or rum agricole. Okay? The English or British style, the only one you've probably ever heard of is Pusser's Navy rum. You maybe not have even heard of that. But in Tortuga and or the British Virgin Gorda Islands, they make a pot distilled rum from sugarcane molasses. Very good, very tasty. And then finally, the Dutch. My name's Van Flandern. We invented gin in the 1600s, but we can't make rum worth crap. So they just do whatever the hell they want, and there's no real rules governing Dutch rum. So we just pretend that they don't exist. And that would be like Aruba or Belize down in near the Venezuelan border. And those are some Dutch provinces, and they kind of make some swill. It's cheap rum, probably column distilled from molasses, and not very good. All right, that's that. And you see that statistic in 1775, when this is just before George Washington, Thomas Jefferson discovered those amber fields of grain, before we declared our independence from Great Britain. Up until that point, rum was king, and Providence, Rhode Island had 31 rum distilleries. It was the rum capital of the world. And the original 13 colonies, with a population of 3 million people, they were distilling 12 million gallons of rum per year. That's 4 gallons of rum for every man, woman, and child per year. But in all fairness, most of that was going back to Europe, you know. And don't forget, when they did declare independence from Great Britain, suddenly that slave trade got cut off because Great Britain was like, what's going on here? I mean, don't get me wrong, the slave trade kept on going, but the sugarcane and the rum going back and forth, they weren't going to pay for that. There were some back channel deals, but generally speaking, they were at war with Great Britain. And when that happened, Americans, a fledgling country, we didn't have a currency. We didn't have dollars. Alexander Hamilton didn't establish the U.S. Treasury until like 1894. 1776 to 1894, we didn't have cash. So everybody bartered for trade, and one of the primary forms of currency was liquor. And both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington both had rye distilleries, because in Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia, there was these amber fields of grain, rye. And they started distilling from rye. And they made a lot of rye whiskey. So we always distill with whatever source of sugar is commonly available. So up until the Revolution, it was rum, because rum was king. We're getting, oh, bless you, by the way. And we get all these barrels of molasses, rum, rum, rum. Then after the Revolution, we're cut off, so we're not getting as much sugar, so we start distilling from rye, rye. Then after the Revolutionary War was over, there was the Great Whiskey Rebellion in the late 1800s, 1875 or something like that. It was a 4-year rebellion, and all the master distillers who were making rye, they fought, and they finally got put down by the new American government, so they all plunged into the Ohio Valley, where they discovered maize or corn, and they started distilling from corn, which was commonly abundant and available, and that's how we switched from rye whiskey over to bourbon. In case you're wondering how that arc happened. So, there you go. we've all heard of proof versus alcohol by volume. 2 points of proof is 1 point of alcohol by volume. So if something is 100 proof, it's 50% alcohol by volume. It can go up to 200. If it's 200 proof, it's 100% alcohol. But that's the idea. The way that turned out is because back in the day, all the way up until 1974, but all dating way back to the wooden ships, if you were a British sailor, a limey, part of your daily salary, in addition to whatever meager wages they paid you, was you got a daily tot of rum, which is approximately a pint of rum. That, just keep them soused, you know, as long as they got a pint of rum every day. But the thing is, if you ever ran out of rum, if you were the captain and you ran out of rum, almost guaranteed mutiny, and that meant they would take the captain and throw him overboard. They'd probably commandeer the ship and try to sell it. They're pirates now, but you know, you better not run out of rum. That's our salary. It's like running. It's like going, hey, sorry, we can't pay you this week. You're like, I'm out of here. So these guys, they couldn't go anywhere. So get rid of the captain and take the ship. You're going to get their money some way or another. They didn't have accurate measurements back then to determine the exact percentage of alcohol. But what they did know is that if they stored those boughs in the front of the ship on the ocean, it would go slosh up and down and it would accelerate the aging and it would make it taste better faster. It's also where they stored the gunpowder. And it's also where they stored other things. And so now it's been a long day. You know, you've been swabbing the deck and, matey, doing all your pirate work and all your stuff. And it's like, hey, the sun's gone down. Time to get our pay. Go get our daily tot of rum. Okay, well, turn on the lights. Well, we don't have electricity yet. Oh, okay, we don't have electricity. Well, let me grab this gas lantern, and I'll just go downstairs in these rocking waves. Oh yeah, it's a little pitchy today. Okay, well, now where's that? Does this one have? No, that doesn't have alcohol. That has gunpowder in it. No. Oh, here's one with alcohol. Oops, I drop it. Boom. The whole ship blows up because it's right next to the gunpowder, but it flashes on. Boom. So one way of stretching out the rum, where's all the rum gone? The way to make that rum stretch out was to water it down. And by taking it off the still at 46 to 80% alcohol by volume and taking it down to about 40% or 80 proof, at 80 proof, if I dropped a lantern into the alcohol, it wouldn't flash ignite. The liquid would extinguish it. Now, if I held a flame to it, eventually it would ignite. But just dropping it in, it wouldn't flash ignite. So 80 proof was the standard for rum, and is to this day, all your rums and all your vodkas and all your tequilas are 40% alcohol by volume or 80 proof. Now we finally, as science developed, we developed instruments that could accurately measure the percentage of alcohol, and we could tell exactly how much alcohol, and just by coincidence, 2 points of proof happened to equal 1 point of alcohol. That is a coincidence, but that's how that came about. You know, I used to work at the Carlisle Hotel after Per Se, in New York City, very famous hotel. And I was consulting for them, but I was doing some stuff for like a 1-year consulting job. Great job, by the way. And the bartenders were all union, and this guy was union. He had been there for 50 years. 50 years behind the same stick. One bartender. Can you imagine working at the same bar for 50 years? He'd met like 4 presidents. He was like a legend, this guy. His name was Tommy Rowells. He got off, at 17 years old, he got off the boat from Ireland. And the guy's like, down at the docks, he's like going, well, okay, son, what can you do? And he's like, oh, I don't know what I can do. I suppose I could be a barback. He's going, son, you're Irish. You're not going to be a barback. You're going to be a bartender. You're going to be a bartender at the Carlisle. And he sends him up to this guy. The guy's like, what are you sending me this Irish kid for? He doesn't know how to bartend. He's going, he's Irish. He'll learn on the job. 50 years later, he's at the same bar, and he's bartending. Now, he's the man. And I come in, and I'm consulting, so I'm being very delicate because it's his bar. He's union. They can kick me out, so I'm really polite around him. And after 50 years, I said, you know, Tommy, anybody who's worked at the same bar for 50 years needs to have a cocktail named after them. I said, what's your favorite cocktail to drink? He said, oh, that's easy, a Heineken. I said, a Heineken? I said, okay. What's your favorite cocktail to make? And he goes, Heineken. I was like, okay. So I made him a cocktail. It's not, he probably never even drank it. He wasn't there. But funny guy, Tommy Rowells. All right, now, brandy. All right. So brandy, what is brandy made from? What's the raw material used to make brandy?
Fruit.
I'm going to say fruit, because any brandies can be made from many, many, many different fruits or vegetables. And it is true that most well brandies and most famous brandies that you're thinking of are made from grapes, but by no means all. Okay? For example, in Normandy, France, they make a well-established, famous brandy made from apples and or pears. And it's very tasty and very delicious. And who knows what the name of that is? You ever heard of Calvados? Okay, well now you have. Calvados is a brandy made from apples or pears. If it's made from cherries, it's called Kirsch. Kirsch. If it's made from raspberries, it's called Framboise. If it's made from strawberries, it's Fraise. If it's made from pears, it's called Poire Williams. By the way, if it's unaged fruit brandy is called eau de vie. Anybody speak any French? You know what eau de vie means? Eau de vie means water of life. What is vodka or vodka also means water of life. Whiskey or Erskey or Yuski means water of life. Akavie from Finland and Norway and Sweden, which is kind of like a vodka that is infused with botanicals, but it has either dill or caraway or both. That's what makes Akavie instead of gin. You don't have to know that, but just FYI. Akavie means water of life. You guys know Pisco? Is an unaged Peruvian brandy. And Pisco means? No, I have no idea what it means, but I was messing with you. Pisco actually is the city. It used to be part of Argentina, and then now it's part of Peru. All right, so a lot of the best brandies in the world are made from grapes, and there are several cognacs. Cognac and Armagnac are two of them, are some of the most famous brandies in the world, and Pisco from Peru or Argentina. And you do have a Pisco here. Where's Cognac made? In Cognac, France, in the Cognac region of France. That's right. And it's made from grapes. And there are three major grapes. There's Uni Blanc, Fol Blanche, and Folgnon, and actually Colombard. There are four grapes now that you use to make cognac. There are different classifications. Cognac's all about the art of blending. They take the old stuff and they blend it with the new stuff. So it's really rare to see a year on a bottle of cognac. You know, you don't see a 1984 cognac very often. Only Hein does that, and they only do that once in a great while. Usually it has a designation of VS, VSOP. They have new designations. So the designations are VS, VSOP, Napoleon, XO, and now they have XXO. And all of those have very specific age designations. VS stands for what?
Very special.
Very special. VSOP stands for?
Very special old something.
First of all, it's my favorite trivia question because the S doesn't stand for special in VSOP. So VS is very special, VSOP is very superior, old pale. Old pale. Napoleon Bonaparte actually loved cognac, and his favorite cognac to drink was Courvoisier. And he drank a lot of Courvoisier. And so Courvoisier created a special aged or older cognac, which they called Napoleon. But because it was named after Napoleon Bonaparte, they couldn't trademark it just to them. So all cognacs are allowed to make Napoleon-style cognac. Then we have XO, which is extraordinary or extra old, and then XXO, which is extra extraordinary or extra extra old. So here's the designation. VS is 2 years or more. Remember, they're blending old stuff with new stuff. So you might have this much 2-year, and this much 6-year, 5-year, 4-year, 3-year. They're just blending old stuff with new stuff. But the youngest has to be 2 years minimum. VSOP, the youngest stuff is 4 years, but it surely has some 6 or 8-year stuff in there as well. Maybe just a little bit of the 8-year, but a lot of 4-year. Napoleon is 6-year. Youngest is 6 years. XO, the youngest is 10 years. And XXO, the youngest O to V, is going to be up to 14 years old. Like Remy XO, for example, Remy XO, the youngest O to V is 12 years old. But it has some that's up to 60 years old. This much 60-year-old, this much 59, 58, 57, 56, all the way up to this much 12-year-old. And you blend it all together and you taste it and you have this great cognac. All cognacs are brandy, but not all brandy is cognac because it has a denomination of origin and appellation control. It can only be made in this region, and they have very strict rules governing it. You guys know what the biggest 4 cognac producers are? Hennessy's number 1, far and away. Courvoisier. Remy Martin is number 2, then Courvoisier, and the 4th one, Martell. But there's also some extraordinary other cognacs as well, like Hein, RD, Frappin is one of my favorites. It's extraordinary. I've been to about 14 cognac distilleries, and man, something you should know about cognac. Who's my bartenders? Can any of you guys tell me what's in a mint julep?
Yeah. Bourbon.
Bourbon.
Spirit.
I just want to know the base spirit.
Base spirit.
Yeah, bourbon. What is in, anybody know what's in a French 75? Gin. Anybody know what's in a Sazerac?
Rye.
Rye. All 3 of those cognac cocktails were originally made with cognac. When you think of mint julep, you think of Kentucky Derby. You think Kentucky bourbon country is bourbon. But the original was made with cognac. In 1875, there was a blight called phylloxera. It was a parasite, and it wiped out 98% of the grapevines in Europe, almost destroyed the entire wine industry. And cognac being made from grapes became prohibitively expensive to use in cocktails. It was considered too expensive and too posh to use in a cocktail. So those 3 cocktails, the mint julep, originally made with cognac. Delicious, by the way. And so we stopped using cognac in cocktails for many years, except for after World War I, there was a American GI who'd commandeered a German motorcycle that had a bucket seat next to the motorcycle, called a little sidecar, right? And he pulled up in front of the Hemingway bar at the Ritz Paris, and he had just stolen this motorcycle. And it says, hey, they just liberated Paris, and the French were very thankful to the Americans. And he says, hey, it's very cold. Can you tell the bartender to send me out something to take the little chill out of the air? So the guy came out, and he did something with cognac and lemon juice and Cointreau, and he set it right onto the bucket seat there. And the American sipped on it and goes, that's delicious. What do you call that? He goes, Monsieur, it is a sidecar. And that's how the sidecar cocktail became. But that's the only real cocktail. If you think about all your great cognac cocktails, the sidecar is really the only one that comes to mind. But those other 3 I mentioned were all originally made with cognac, and only now is cognac becoming popular in cocktails again. And I want to put 1 or 2 of them on you. I'm going to make you guys a real chocolate martini made with cognac, and it's going to knock your socks off. Very tasty, very delicious. And by the way, the Sazerac, the French, we think about New Orleans. New Orleans has a rich history. The Sazerac is the official cocktail of New Orleans, and they love it down there. So, and it was originally made with cognac, and then it switched to rye, and then Peychaud bitters and absinthe rents and all that stuff. So, anybody want to take a guess? What city? So America, I digress. VSOP, XO, those are all English words. Very special, very superior. This is a French spirit. Why are those English words? What?
Colonization.
Well, no. Good guess, though. I like where your head's at. Is because America was the biggest importer of cognac in the world, followed by the Brits and French is number 4. I think these days China is a huge importer. Kim Jong-un, the predecessor, the father of Kim Jong-il, the dictator in North Korea, had one of the largest cognac collections in the world. And so it's a status symbol in mainland China. Drinking fine cognac is very posh, and same with France, and same in America. I mean, they have these beautiful crystal decanters and these beautiful, well-made distillates. Can anybody guess? I'll give you a hint. America is the biggest importer of cognac in the world. Can anybody guess what American city is the biggest importer of cognac in the world?
Is it somewhere in the Midwest? Twice per year.
That's a good guess. What's that?
Boston.
We both said Houston.
Houston. No, it's not in Texas. Chicago's a pretty good guess, but it's not Chicago.
New Orleans?
Not New Orleans.
St. Louis.
What?
St. Louis.
Nope, not St. Louis. I'll tell you. Shall I tell you? Detroit, Michigan. And that's because Detroit, Michigan is the birth of Motown and the hip hop community, and the black American community has embraced cognac as a status symbol. And if you go to cognac and you say, who do you love? They say, we love the United States of America. And you say, who do you love in the United States? They say, we love Detroit, Michigan, because they drink a tremendous amount of cognac. And if you go there, the French, they just want to sell more cognac. I actually did the first International Mixology Cognac Summit there. I had 5 Brits, 5 Americans, 5 Germans, and 5 Frenchmen. And we all got together and we were talking about the future of cognac and cocktails. And while we were doing that, the owners came up and said, let me get this straight. You want to take my great-great-grandfather's cognac, my great-great-great-grandfather's cognac, and put juices and sugars into it and make cocktails. I said, well, yes, but we're going to approach it like a great Michelin 3-star chef, and we're going to balance the acids and sugars, and we're going to showcase the cognac in a new way, and it's going to taste extraordinary. And they said, and this is going to sell more cognac. And we said, well, yes, that's the idea, sure. And he goes, mon ami, and he kissed 2 cheeks. He's like, this is wonderful, we're going to sell more cognac. Meanwhile, there was the owner of, there's a Champagne Cristal. I think it was, I'm sorry, I don't know a rap artist, but I think it was Jay-Z or something like that, had rhymes in his lyrics about Cristal champagne. And the owner of Cristal came out publicly, and it's not a direct quote, but he basically said something to the effect of, oh, this is a fine champagne, it's really not meant for those people, or something like that. And it was of course, there was a huge boycott, and they shut him down, and that was, Jay-Z came out with Ace of Spades champagne. I don't remember, it's Ace of Spades, right? And the African American community was like, screw you. And Cristal lost a ton of money. The Caucasian American community was like, dude, you can't say that. So they lost a fortune. But in cognac, they're like, I don't care about the color of your skin. I don't care. If you love what we're doing, then we love you. And they just want to sell more cognac. So that's a little bit of your history there. All right, so that's brandy. Any question? Oh, by the way, Louis XIII. You see that bottle up there? Do you guys have a bottle of Louis XIII?
No, we don't.
Well, that bottle right there, Louis XIII usually sells for about $3,500. Maybe now it's like $4,000. Who knows? But that's the 1 liter bottle. That bottle was originally discovered on property owned by the Count Remy Martin, and some serf had an oxen and a plow and was plowing up an old battlefield, because every plot of land in France was one time a battlefield. And he was digging up this old battlefield, and his plow hit what he thought was a stone, and he dug up that bottle made in pewter. Pewter is kind of like a silver-like metal, right? And so they were like, that's amazing. So they didn't know the history of the story, but it had the fleur-de-lis, the French fleur-de-lis, and it was a beautiful bottle. And so Count Remy Martin commissioned the Baccarat family, who makes crystal, to redesign the bottle in crystal. And that bottle is gorgeous, and it actually, it originally was leaded crystal. If you ever get a bottle of Remy Martin before 1984, don't drink it, because Stanford University showed that the ethanol in the alcohol eventually leaches all that lead into the actual liquid, and you can get lead poisoning. But they've solved that problem. The new bottle doesn't do that. And the point is that it's a gorgeous bottle, and back in the day, we used to sell it for $150 a shot. Today it's more like $375, $400 a shot. But I remember back in the day, one of my big fun tips was the guy came up to me and said, he says, it was usually tradition, whoever buys the last shot gets to keep the bottle when your customers come in. Because we'd sell a bottle once a month or once every other month, and whoever bought that last shot, they got to keep the bottle. This guy comes in and goes, hey Brian, how many shots of Louis got in there? And I looked at him and I said, oh, looks like about 4 shots. He goes, okay. Pulls out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He pulled out $600. He goes, I want the bottle. I said, all right, well, you can have the bottle, but you can't walk out of here with 4 shots of Louis. I mean, I'm going to lose my liquor license. I can't do that for you. He's like, yeah. Want to do a couple shots of Louis with me? And I was like, yes, I do. So I did 2 shots of Louis with this as a $300 tip. And then and that was the first time I had Louis. Now, since then, I redesigned the program for the Plaza Hotel in New York City, and we had the only bottle of Louis XIII Black Pearl 1 liter bottle in the United States. They make it, you can get the 750s anymore, but the 1 liter was the only one in the United States, and we had it at the Plaza Hotel. That was about $35,000 for that bottle. And we charged $2,000 a shot. And I found some pre-Nazi Germany Cointreau from Angers, France, and some Black Pearl, and we made a $2,500 sidecar, which we sold to rich people because we could. So anyway, little nerdy things, but there's other. All right, so that's brandy, that's cognac. So there's another thing called fortified wines. Fortified wines are like vermouths and what else? Sherries and Madeiras and ports. What is a vermouth? A vermouth is a fortified aromatized wine. There's sweet vermouth and dry vermouth. What that means is we take a wine and we take some of that wine and we distill it into spirit. We make eau de vie. And we take that unaged eau de vie and we pour a little bit back into the wine, raising the alcohol above 16% or around 16%, so that all the yeast is killed off, and now it's fortified and it's preserved longer. The shelf life will stay fresh longer. And then we aromatize it by infusing it with botanicals. Not juniper, but other botanicals. And usually the botanical list is a secret because they're French and or Italians have trade secrets, so they don't tell their recipes. But the point is, dried vermouth is white wine with a little bit of spirit added back to it and infused with dried botanicals. Sweet vermouth is usually a wine, often a white wine, that is then infused with barks and other botanicals which are very bitter. It's fortified with alcohol, infused with these barks and bitter stuff, and then caramel or other sweeteners are added to it to balance out the bitterness. It's not particularly sweet, but it's not particularly bitter. It's balanced, and it's a really lovely thing for Manhattans and other kind of stuff. But that's what a vermouth is. Now, a sweet vermouth has sugar, and the sugar will fortify it. It'll also preserve the life of it longer. A dry vermouth with no sugar will not last very long, which is why Americans ask for their martinis dry, or extra dry, or extra, extra dry. And pretty soon you're just looking at the bottle really hard or waving it over the top. Okay? If we just put a drop in there and swirl it around and rinse it out, it makes sense, because if that bottle has been sitting out for a long time, what happens to a bottle of wine if I leave it open for 24 or 48 hours?
It's like vinegar.
It becomes oxidized, it becomes bitter, it becomes skunky, right? Right? We can't leave wine open for more than a day or two. Same is true with a fortified wine. It will last longer, but it won't last for more than a week or two at the outside. And so if we're only doing a drop, the less vermouth we use, the longer it takes to use the bottle, the more skunky it gets over the time, the worse it tastes. It's a vicious cycle. So I always recommend our dry vermouth should always get the small bottles, and then we should refrigerate those bottles and keep them and use them fresh. Because the original vodka martini was 50-50. It was 50% vermouth and 50% vodka. That sounds disgusting to us today, but I can make you one tomorrow and you'd be like, hey man, that doesn't taste so bad, but we're gonna have to use a fresh bottle of vermouth, dry vermouth. And he's like, no, it's pretty tasty when it's done properly. So that's what fortified wines are. Finally, we're gonna end the day, we're gonna talk about liqueurs. I'm gonna wrap it up early because I can see you guys are like, by the way, you guys are troopers for hanging in as long as you have, so thank you for that. I just wanna finish the day talking about liqueurs. These liqueurs all have stories behind them. Pick up those bottles, read the labels, but they're all different stories. And we could talk for hours and hours on that. We're not going to. But I want to say, what's the difference between a liquor and a liqueur?
It's below 40% alcohol. Would that be killing a liqueur?
Well, nope. It's a good guess, but that's a very intelligent guess because most liqueurs are lower in alcohol than 40%, but it's simply not the case. First of all, there are several liquors. Don Julio, for example, in Mexico is 38% ABV, not 40%. So there are many liquors that are below, sochu and these other things are well below 40%, and they don't have extra sugar. The key to a liqueur versus a liquor is that it has copious amounts of sugar added after distillation. Copious amounts of sugar. Cognac, they're allowed to add a touch of caramel for color adjustment. Mixto tequilas, they add a little bit of caramel, they give you a sugar headache. But a liqueur like Frangelico, Grand Marnier, Kahlua, Malibu, Midori, these have tons and tons of sugar added to them. They're super sweet, and then we can balance them out with things like lime juice and the like. But they all have different stories. So what's the difference between, what is triple sec? It's an orange liqueur. So what is Cointreau? Oh, it's an orange liqueur. Okay. What is Grand Marnier? What?
Doesn't it have brandies or brandy?
So, Cointreau is a triple sec. It says it on the label. It says a triple dry. Triple sec means dry, so it's a triple dry. But it still has is sweet, but that's what they call it. Cointreau is a sugar beet base. It's distilled from sugar beets. And then after they distill from sugar beets, they take bittersweet oranges and they dry out the skins and they infuse that into the sugar beet alcohol. The alcohol strips all the oils out of the dried skins, and you have this orange scented, orange flavored sugar beet distillate. And then they take sugar beet sugar syrup and add it back to the distillate, and they have this orange flavored, delicious sugar beet base orange liqueur. Grand Marnier, they take cognac. It's a cognac base, but they take oranges. Have you ever accidentally lost an orange under the couch or something like that, under the fridge, and found it 3 months later and it was green? Of course, you guys never did, but you went to your roommate and you found that green orange, had that mold around it. In Grand Marnier, they actually introduced that mold to the oranges and let them get really thick and moldy, green and moldy. And then they put that in with the cognac, and during distillation, all of that mold is killed off, but it has so much orange flavor, extracts all this cool flavor out of it, and then you get the cognac as a base, and now you have this really beautiful orange flavored cognac. It's an orange liqueur. Lots of sugar to it, added after the fact. Probably beet sugar as well. No, it's cognac flavor. It's probably caramel. Caramel, for sure. Anyway, triple sec is about 10, by the way, Cointreau, 40% alcohol by volume. Cognac, Grand Marnier, 40% alcohol by volume. Absinthe, 50% alcohol, 60% alcohol by volume, with lots of sugar added to it. But triple sec is made from high fructose corn syrup. It's column distilled neutral grain spirit, and then they use compounded artificial orange flavoring. And it's usually about 15 to 20% alcohol by volume, 15% alcohol by volume. So Cointreau costs twice as much as triple sec, but if I use 1/3 as much Cointreau in my drink, I have the same amount of alcohol as the triple sec. And it's made from sugar beets and it's made from fresh oranges ingredients. This costs twice as much, but I use 1/3 in a cocktail. Cointreau is much more cost effective than triple sec by alcohol, by volume. And it's natural and it tastes so much better. So much better. So my recommendation is just to get rid of triple sec from behind the bar 100%. Just get rid of triple sec. And we use Cointreau exclusively, and we can use cane sugar syrup or another simple syrup to balance out any additional sugar we need. But at 40% ABV, you get all the flavor, the right amount of alcohol, and you don't need to use triple sec at all. Kill it. Frangelico, made by a monk named Frangelico, who lived on the River Po in Italy, and he was famous for making liqueurs from nuts and berries. And you know, he used to wear those Franciscan monk robes with the little cord around it. How do I know all that?
Bottle.
I read the front of the bottle. I didn't have to read the back of the bottle. It's right in the front. The whole story is right there. And it's a hazelnut liqueur. What is amaretto? We think it's an almond liqueur. Where's it get flavor from?
Peach pit.
Apricot pits. Good guess though. I mean, good call. Apricot stones, and they can use almonds. But yes, and by the way, Di Serono. What is Di Serono? I'll tell you what it isn't. It is an amaretto. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, it used to be called Amaretto di Serono, and then the Italian government sued them and said, "Hey, we have laws and we have rules governing how to make amaretto, and you're not following the rules." And they won the lawsuit. And so Amaretto di Serono had to take amaretto off the label. But it was so well known, it was the #1 selling amaretto in the United States, that to this day they just say Di Serono, and everyone knows, oh yeah, it's Di Serono, is that amaretto. Never says amaretto anywhere on the label. If you want an authentic amaretto, get something like Luxardo amaretto, not to be confused with cherry liqueur. Amaretto, delicious, delicious. Anyway, every single one of these has a story, and all the cheap stuff is just neutral grain spirit with usually high fructose corn syrup and artificial colors and flavors added to it, like green creme de menthe and green creme de noix, red creme de noix, and white creme de cacao or brown creme de cacao. And so these are all just generic, like Marie Brizard and Hiram Walker. They just make generic liqueurs that are cheap and common. You know, Bailey's Irish Cream. What's Bailey's Irish Cream made from? Well, and the name wasn't one of them. Cream. There's cream in there. We know there's lots of sugar in there, right? Whiskey. Well, what kind of whiskey? Irish whiskey. Do you guys carry Irish whiskey here? Oh, you do carry Irish whiskey. Do you think the chef has some sugar in the back that we could borrow? A little sugar, syrup, some kind of sugar? Yeah. Do you think we get some half and half or some heavy cream or anything like that? Why are we not making our own Irish cream? Taste Restaurant Irish Cream. We can control the sugar level. It tastes delicious. That's thinking like a mixologist. Think outside the box. Make our own Irish cream. St. Patty's Day, you put a drop of food color in there if you want, or something like that. But in the day, you make your own Irish cream. The only catch is you have to let your guests know. I did it one time with you know Jeffrey Zakarian from the Food Network? No? He had a restaurant, and we put an Irish cream on the menu, and everyone loved it, and they were drinking it, a ton of it. And then I was in there for a couple of weeks, and about 4 or 5 days in, this young lady came back. She goes, "Oh, this guy sent it back. He said he didn't like it." And I said, "Oh no?" I said, "Well, what did he say?" And he goes, "Well, he ordered Bailey's, and he tasted it. And he says, this isn't Bailey's." And I was going, "Well, it's not Bailey's. You gotta kind of, you can't just say, somebody says, I want a Bailey's Irish Cream. Sure, here you go. This is not Bailey's. It tasted like Bailey's, but we balanced it out, and it was fresh ingredients." I said, "You got to sell it. You got to sit there and say, I'm afraid we don't have Bailey's, but if you like, we make our own Irish cream in-house with fresh half and half, a little sugar syrup, and a beautiful Irish whiskey. It's actually, in my opinion, so much better than Bailey's. Wouldn't you want to try that? Wouldn't you want to try it? Say, I'll give it a go. And now you know you're not tasting Bailey's, but you know you're tasting something different. And now you taste it, and it's not as sweet on purpose. It's just because you drink one thing of Bailey's, you're like, oh, ugh, it's so sweet, it's too much. But now you taste it and you go, oh, it tastes like a light Bailey's, but really yummy and creamy and delicious. Now the guy's like, oh, that's awesome. That's my new favorite Irish cream. And he tells all his friends, you got to go to Taste, man. They're making this cool. They make their own Irish cream. It's sick. And that's a silly example, but that's just one example of how we can think outside of the box. At Per Se, I was making my own tonic water from scratch. Today, you'll find lots of bartenders all around the world making their own tonic water. Back in 2004, nobody was doing that. Nobody. You only had Schweppes, Seagram's, and Canada Dry. And you had a bunch of pretenders trying to be Schweppes, Seagram's, and Canada Dry. But I started making raw quinine and making my own tonic water from scratch. We were selling them for $20 a pop back in 2004. And when they wrote the 4-star review of the restaurant, they say, the food's great, the service is great, everything's great. They even make their own tonic water from scratch, which is incredible. I was going, ching. So, let's think outside of the box. Okay, we're done for the day. Here's the deal. Tomorrow, we're going to roll out the new cocktail menu. It's going to be a much more tasty day tomorrow. And we're going to show you how to build them, and it's going to be a lot more fun. For the rest of the week, no more lectures, no more PowerPoint presentations. It's all mixing and tasting and learning.